Welcome back, my friend. If this story keeps you company tonight, a like helps more than you'd think. It's how these stories find their way to more people like you. Now let's get into it. My name is Ellen Fisk, and for 6 years I ran patrol out of a small station covering a stretch of the Maine coast so remote that most of it doesn't appear on tourist maps at all. Granite headlands, spruce-choked islands, tide pools that fill and empty on the schedule, older than any of the charts we use to track them. I want to tell you about the autumn I was 29, the season a lighthouse that had been dark for 40 years started showing a light again. And about the 11 nights it took me to understand that some things the sea takes back don't stay taken. I'll start with the lighthouse itself, because you need to understand what it was before you understand what it became. Holloway Light sat on a spit of rock about 9 miles offshore from our station. A squat, granite tower built in the 1880s to warn ships off a shoal that had claimed more than its share of hulls before the light went up. It had been automated in the 1960s, like most of the coast's lighthouses. The keeper's cottage beside it left to the weather, once the Coast Guard no longer needed a person living out there to trim a wick and wind a clockwork mechanism. The automated light itself had been decommissioned entirely in the early 1980s, replaced by a simpler buoy system closer to the actual shoal. The tower and cottage left standing but dark, owned on paper by the Coast Guard, visited maybe twice a year by a maintenance crew checking that the structure itself wasn't actively falling into the sea. I'd been out to Holloway myself exactly twice in 6 years of running that patrol, both times as part of routine structural checks, both times unremarkable. A cold, wind-swept island with a cracked granite tower, a collapsed cottage roof, gulls nesting in the old lamp room. Nothing that gave any hint of what that place would eventually show me. I want to describe the coast itself too, because it matters to understanding how a light 40 miles from the nearest town could go unnoticed as long as it did before anyone official took it seriously. That stretch of Maine runs to fog more mornings than not in the fall, thick enough some days that our own station could lose sight of the water 50 yards past the dock. And the coastline itself is a maze of islands and inlets and granite ledges that swallow sound and sight in a way that means a light on a supposedly dark tower could burn for hours before anyone with reason to notice happened to be looking in the right direction at the right time. Our station itself sat at the edge of a small fishing town, more outpost than headquarters. 4 officers on rotation covering close to 60 miles of coastline that ranged from working harbors with real boat traffic to stretches so empty and rockbound that weeks could pass without a single vessel needing our attention at all. I'd taken the posting straight out of training, 6 years earlier, drawn by a description that promised real, hands-on search and rescue work, rather than the more procedural harbor management duty that busier stations offered. And I'd never once regretted that choice. Not through 6 winters of brutal cold water rescues. Not through the endless gray stretches of fog season that tested every instrument and every instinct a person had. The work had taught me to read that coast the way you learn to read a difficult, moody companion, which fog banks burned off by mid-morning and which ones settled in for the whole day, which stretches of water turned dangerous fast when a nor'easter's fast when a nor'easter. Built offshore, which of the scattered islands held safe anchorage in a squall, and which ones you avoided even in calm weather because the currents around them did things no chart fully captured. Holloway had never been one I thought much about at all. A decommissioned structure on my patrol maps, more as a navigational reference point than an actual place with any bearing on my daily work. The first report came from a lobsterman named Curtis Meade, working pots off the shoal near Holloway Well before dawn on a clear October morning, who radioed it in almost apologetically, the way people do when they're fairly sure what they're describing doesn't make sense. He said he'd seen a light on the old tower, steady, not the automated buoy's blink pattern, but something closer to the old rotating beam lighthouses used to throw, sweeping slow circles out across the water for a good 20 minutes before it simply went out. I drove out to the harbor myself the following afternoon to talk with him directly, more out of a station officer's ordinary thoroughness than any real suspicion that his account needed further scrutiny. Curtis had worked those waters close to 30 years, a broad, weathered man with the particular calm of someone who'd seen every kind of weather and every kind of trouble those waters could produce. Not the type prone to seeing things that weren't there. He described the light again for me, standing on his own dock with his hands tucked into his coat pockets against the wind, careful and precise about the details. The color a warm amber rather than the buoy's colder white. The rotation slow and even, roughly one full sweep every 12 or 15 seconds by his estimate. The duration, long enough that he'd had time to cut his engine and simply watch for several minutes before finally deciding he ought to radio it in. He told me, almost as an aside, that his grandfather had fished those same waters back when Holloway still had an actual keeper, decades before the automation, and that the old man used to talk about the keeper's light the way sailors talk about landmarks that matter to them personally, something dependable in country that otherwise offered very little dependability at all. Curtis said watching that light sweep the water again, decades after his grandfather's stories, had given him a feeling he couldn't fully name, somewhere between comfort and a wrongness he understood only in hindsight. Once he'd had time to actually think through what he was describing rather than simply reacting to it in the moment. I logged it as an equipment anomaly, possibly related to the buoy system malfunctioning in a way that made it appear, from a distance and in poor light, like it was coming from the tower rather than the water. I sent that theory up the chain along with the report, and nobody above me pushed back on it, because it was the kind of explanation that let everyone involved keep doing their actual jobs without diverting resources to check a decommissioned lighthouse over a single lobsterman's pre-dawn sighting. The second report came 4 nights later, from a different source entirely, a research vessel doing survey work well outside our usual patrol range, whose crew radioed in an unscheduled light sighting on Holloway with enough specificity, including a rough duration and bearing, that it became harder to write off as equipment malfunction or a tired man's eyes playing tricks before sunrise. I want to be honest that even after that second report, I still wanted the explanation to be mechanical. 6 years of running that patrol had taught me that the ocean produces strange sightings constantly, phosphorescence and fog banks and reflected moonlight doing things that look, from the wrong angle, like almost anything a frightened or exhausted mind wants to make of them. I requested a maintenance flyover rather than a boat trip, hoping a simple aerial pass would confirm equipment failure and let the whole thing resolve itself without anyone needing to actually set foot back on that island. The flyover found nothing. No light burning during the daylight pass. No visible damage to the tower's old lamp housing. Nothing that supported an equipment malfunction theory at all. Which meant, if both reports were accurate, that whatever was producing that light was either extremely intermittent or wasn't equipment at all. I want to give you a sense of what those next several days actually felt like, because they were, on the surface, entirely ordinary. Patrol runs, paperwork, the normal rhythm of a small station's routine, interrupted only by an occasional conversation with my station commander, a steady, thoughtful man named Frank Dellery, about whether the Holloway sightings warranted an actual visit or could reasonably be left as an unexplained curiosity in the log. Frank was inclined at first toward the second option. 6 years working under him had taught me he wasn't a man who chased mysteries for their own sake, preferring, always, the explanation that required the least disruption to the station's actual mission, which was fundamentally about keeping boats and the people on them safe rather than investigating strange lights on a structure that hadn't functioned as an actual navigational aid in 40 years. What changed his mind was the third report, which came not from a fisherman or a research crew, but from our own station's automated weather buoy, positioned close enough to Holloway that its onboard light sensor, designed to log ambient conditions, for meteorological purposes, had recorded a distinct sustained spike in light levels during 3 separate overnight windows across the preceding 2 weeks. Data nobody had thought to check until I requested it specifically, curious whether the buoy's instruments might offer something more objective than eyewitness accounts. I remember sitting at the small workstation in the back of our station office, pulling that sensor data up on the aging computer we used for weather logging, half expecting to find nothing at all, some flat, unremarkable readout that would let the whole strange week quietly resolve into an unexplained curiosity rather than something that demanded further attention. Instead, I found 3 distinct spikes, clean and unmistakable against the otherwise steady baseline of ambient darkness the sensor logged every other night of that month, each one appearing at almost exactly the position I'd have predicted if I'd drawn a line from the buoy straight to Holloway's tower. I sat with that screen a long time before calling Frank over, running the numbers twice to be sure I wasn't simply seeing what I already half expected to see, the particular trap of a mind that spent a week turning a mystery over and might, without meaning to, start finding patterns that aren't really there. But the data held up under a second look exactly as it had under the first. 3 separate nights. Consistent duration. Consistent bearing. Nothing about it read as noise or malfunction. The kind of clean signal that meteorological equipment produces when it's recording something real, rather than a glitch in its own circuitry. The data matched. 3 separate nights, each spike lasting between 15 and 40 minutes, each occurring sometime after midnight, each strong enough and localized enough in the sensor's directional reading to point almost precisely at Holloway's position. Not equipment malfunction. Not reflected moonlight or phosphorescence, which wouldn't have produced that kind of sustained directional intensity. Something on that island was undeniably producing light on a schedule that had nothing obviously predictable about it beyond the fact that it always happened well after dark. Frank authorized a boat trip. We went out on a gray, still morning. Frank and myself, and a younger officer named Dana Petrov, who'd been with the station less than a year. The water, calm enough for once, that the 9-mile run-out felt almost pleasant. Gulls working the wake behind. Our boat, the kind of ordinary coastal morning that made the whole situation feel, for those first 20 minutes, like it might resolve into something mundane after all. Dana had heard the whole story secondhand by then, the way news moves through a small station faster than any official channel, and I noticed her checking her own gear twice over the course of that short run-out, a habit I recognized because I'd caught myself doing the same thing more than once over the preceding week. The small, unconscious rituals people perform when a part of them is bracing for something the rest of them isn't ready to name yet. Frank kept the boat's radio open the whole way, a low, constant murmur of station chatter that felt, that particular morning, less like routine background noise and more like a tether none of us wanted to let go of. Holloway looked, from the water, exactly as I remembered it from my 2 previous visits. A squat granite tower rising maybe 60 feet above the rock. The old keeper's cottage collapsed at one corner where a winter storm had finally taken down what decades of neglect had already weakened, gulls wheeling and calling around the old lamp room the way they always did, using the abandoned structure as a rookery, the way seabirds use anything tall and undisturbed near open water. We tied up at the small, crumbling dock and climbed the worn granite steps toward the tower, and it was somewhere on that climb, maybe 2/3 of the way up, that I first noticed the quiet. I want to describe it carefully, because it's the detail that stayed sharpest. The island, even on a still day, is never actually silent. Gulls constantly, waves working the rock below in a steady, rhythmic wash, wind finding the tower's old iron railings and producing a faint, intermittent hum. All of that dropped away at once, the way a radio cuts when someone releases a transmit key, leaving Frank, Dana, and me standing on those worn granite steps in a silence that had a pressure to it, close and complete, that none of us commented on. Directly, though, I saw Dana's hand drift, unconsciously, toward the sidearm she carried as standard equipment. A gesture I understood completely, even though neither of us could have said in that moment what exactly we thought that sidearm might do against whatever was causing a silence like that. The lamp room itself, when we finally reached it, told a story that made no sense against the tower's 40 years of official abandonment. The old lens mechanism, which every maintenance report for the past 2 decades had listed as non-functional, sat gleaming, its brass fittings polished, entirely free of the salt corrosion that should have coated every exposed metal surface on that exposed, weather-battered structure. The glass itself, which I remembered from my previous visit as cracked and clouded with decades of grime, was clean, catching the gray morning light in a way that made the whole small room feel, disorientingly, like it belonged to an entirely different, much better maintained lighthouse than the one we'd approached from the water. Frank crouched by the mechanism's base, running a gloved hand along a section of brass gearing that should have been frozen solid with rust, and found it turned smoothly, under the lightest pressure, as though it had been oiled and maintained on a regular schedule by someone who cared a great deal about keeping it in working order. Nobody said what all 3 of us were clearly thinking, which was that a structure decommissioned for 40 years, visited by official maintenance crews twice a year at most, should not have looked like this. Should not have functioned at all, let alone with the kind of careful, ongoing maintenance that gleaming brass and freely turning gears implied. We searched the cottage next, what remained of it, and found, tucked into a small, dry alcove that had somehow escaped the worst of the roof's collapse, a logbook, not the original 19th century keeper's log, long since removed to a maritime museum decades before, but a newer one, its pages recent enough that the ink hadn't yet faded, filled with entries in a careful old-fashioned hand that described, in exact, procedural detail, the daily routines of a working lighthouse keeper. Weather observations, lamp maintenance notes, the ordinary record of a job that hadn't officially existed on that island in 4 decades. I sat on an overturned crate in the cottage's driest corner and read through as much of it as the fading afternoon light allowed. Frank and Dana working the rest of the structure for any further evidence, while I worked through page after page after page after page. Entries that grew stranger the longer I read them, not for anything dramatic they described, but for their sheer, patient ordinariness, weather-logged with a precision that matched official meteorological standards decades out of date. Lamp oil consumption tracked in a system of measurement the actual Coast Guard had stopped using generations before I'd even joined. Small personal observations about the gulls and the tides and the particular quality of a sunset, written in a voice that felt, page after page, disconcertingly present, disconcertingly attentive to a world that, as far as any official record was concerned, this keeper had no business still observing at all. One passage, roughly 2/3 of the way through the book, described a ship passing close by the shoal one stormy night, and the keeper's evident relief at having the light ready in time to warn it off, written with a warmth and pride that made the entry feel less like a historical curiosity and more like something written by someone who still, after everything, took genuine satisfaction in doing the job correctly. I remember sitting with that particular entry longer than any other, unable to decide whether it made the whole situation more or less unsettling to imagine whatever kept that light lit still caring. In whatever way it was capable of caring, whatever way it was capable of caring. The ships it was meant to protect. The final entry was dated 11 days before Curtis Meade's first sighting. I read through that logbook standing in the cold, ruined remains of a cottage that shouldn't have had anyone living in it for 40 years, and felt a specific, creeping wrongness settle over me that had nothing to do with the physical evidence itself, and everything to do with what it implied, that someone, or something, had been keeping that light for a very long time, entirely unnoticed, in a routine so careful and complete that it had left no trace anyone official had ever caught. Until 4-4. Reasons the logbook gave no hint of. It had recently started letting itself be seen. We left the island that afternoon with the logbook, photographs, and a level of unease. None of us fully articulated to each other on the ride back, though I noticed Frank kept glancing back at Holloway's shrinking silhouette longer than the ordinary. Requirements of piloting the boat demanded. Dana, sitting beside me at the stern, asked quietly whether I thought a person could actually be living out there, hidden, all this time, and I told her I didn't know, though I don't think either of us fully believed the possibility we were both too polite to say out loud, which was that whatever had kept that light wasn't a person at all, or hadn't been one for a very long time. The run back to the mainland felt considerably longer than the run out had, despite covering the identical 9 miles, none of us saying much of anything. The boat's engine and the ordinary slap of the hull against light chopped the only sound filling a silence that had nothing peaceful about it. I remember watching the mainland's low, familiar shoreline slowly resolve out of the afternoon haze, and feeling a relief so specific and physical it startled me. A tightness in my chest I hadn't fully registered until it started to ease. Frank filed a report that stuck to observable fact. Anomalous light readings, evidence of recent unauthorized occupation and maintenance, a recovered logbook requiring further review, and requested authorization for an overnight surveillance team to determine whether the light would appear again, and if so, who or what was responsible for it. That authorization came through within the week, and I volunteered for the assignment before Frank had finished explaining the details, a decision I've turned over many times since, trying to understand what exactly made me want to be the one sitting alone on that island after dark, rather than staying safely at the station with everyone else. The week between our boat trip and the authorization coming through was its own strange stretch of ordinary station life, carrying an unspoken weight underneath it. I found myself reading and rereading sections of the logbook during quiet hours at the station, drawn back to it in a way I couldn't fully explain, trying to reconcile the careful, dutiful voice on those pages with the fresh footprints we'd found, wearing a path into 40 years of undisturbed grime. I mentioned the logbook once to my mother on a phone call home, carefully vague about the details, and she asked in the easy way people ask about work they don't fully understand, whether I'd found out who'd been staying out there. I told her we hadn't, which was true, and left it at that, unable to explain that the more pressing question wasn't who but what, and that some part of me had already stopped expecting an answer that would fit comfortably into an ordinary conversation. Frank, for his part, grew quieter that week than I'd ever known him to be, handling the routine business of the station with his usual competence, but with a distracted edge underneath it that I recognized because I felt the same thing myself. A kind of low, constant hum of unresolved unease running beneath every ordinary task. He approved my volunteering for the overnight assignment with less argument than I'd expected, and I understood watching him sign off on the paperwork that some part of him was relieved someone else was willing to be the one to go back out there, even as another part of him, the part responsible for every officer under his command, clearly hated authorizing it at all. I went out alone, 3 nights later, with a small tent, a satellite phone, and instructions to observe from the mainland-facing side of the island, rather than approach the tower directly, unless something specific warranted it. I set up camp in the lee of a granite outcrop about 200 yards from the tower, close enough to maintain a clear sightline, far enough I hoped to give myself some margin if whatever was happening out there turned out to require margin. Setting up that camp alone, with the tower's dark silhouette visible over my shoulder the entire time, was its own kind of exercise in managing fear through routine. The same instinct that had me checking my gear twice on the boat out with Dana a week before. I pitched the tent facing away from the tower deliberately, telling myself it made no practical difference to my sightline, but knowing honestly that some part of me simply didn't want to fall asleep looking directly at that structure, even from 200 yards away. I laid out my binoculars, notebook, and satellite phone in a careful row, just inside the tent flap. Everything within reach without needing to fumble in the dark. A small, practical comfort that felt disproportionately important as the light began to fail. The first night was uneventful in every sense. Cold, clear, the kind of star-heavy sky you only get that far from any town's light pollution. Ordinary gull calls settling into silence as full dark came on. Ordinary waves working the rock below, ordinary waves working the rock below in their steady, patient rhythm. I did hourly checks through the night, stepping out of the tent into air cold enough to bite at any exposed skin, training the binoculars on the tower's silhouette against a sky bright enough with stars that I could make out its edges clearly even without a moon. Nothing. No light. No silence beyond the ordinary silence of a still autumn night on an isolated island. I logged it as a null result and radioed the station at dawn, feeling for the first time since Curtis Meade's original report a small, cautious hope that whatever had been happening might simply have stopped on its own. The second night broke that hope entirely. It started, as it had for Curtis Meade weeks before, sometime well after midnight. A light in the tower's lamp room, steady at first, then beginning that slow, sweeping rotation he'd described, throwing a beam out across the black water in patient, mechanical circles that had nothing frantic or uncertain about them, the light of something that knew exactly how a lighthouse was meant to work, and was executing that function with careful, practiced precision. I'd been awake already when it started, unable to sleep despite the cold and the fatigue, sitting just inside my tent's open flap with the binoculars already resting in my lap, some instinct having kept me watching that dark tower far longer into the far night than my logged hourly checks strictly required. The light didn't build gradually the way a lamp warming up might. It was simply there, all at once, full brightness, as though a switch somewhere had been thrown by a hand that knew exactly the moment it wanted to throw it. I watched it through my binoculars for close to 10 minutes before I trusted myself to reach for the radio, some part of me needing to simply witness it fully before turning any of my attention toward reporting it. The beam swept its slow circles, illuminating brief flashes of the surrounding water and rock each time it passed, catching for a fraction of a second the pale foam where waves broke against the shoal. The light had once been built to warn ships away from a strange, almost tender continuity in watching a decommissioned structure still faithfully performing the one function it had ever been built for. On its third or fourth rotation, I caught, at the very edge of the lamp room's window, a shape, not clearly enough to describe with any confidence, just a darker density against the light behind it, roughly the size and shape of a person standing at Kokar. That window might make there for a fraction of a second, and then gone as the beam swept past, and the angle changed. The cold around my own position seemed to sharpen while I watched, a chill that had nothing to do with the season's ordinary temperature, pressing in against the open tent flap with a specificity that made me finally, belatedly, zip the flap, most of the way closed, some old instinct insisting that whatever was out there across that 200 yards of dark rock might notice an open doorway more readily than a closed one. However little sense that instinct made against something already visibly, undeniably capable of lighting an entire tower on its own. I radioed the station immediately, describing what I was seeing in flat, careful language, and Frank's voice came back steady, telling me a boat was already being readied. that I should stay at my current position and avoid approaching the tower directly under any circumstances. The light continued its slow rotation for close to 30 minutes total, and then, all at once, without any visible cause, it simply stopped, the tower dropping back into the same dark, ordinary silhouette it had held for the previous 40 years, though nothing had ever disturbed it at all. I sat in that sudden darkness a long time afterward, binoculars still raised, though there was nothing left to see through them, waiting for the ordinary sounds of the island to reassert themselves the way they always eventually did. Gulls and wind and waves rebuilding, slowly, into something that almost resembled an ordinary night again. The boat reached me a little after 3 a.m, and I want to describe what we found approaching the tower together, in full flashlight-lit darkness, because it's the piece of this story I still turn over more than any other. The climb up that spiral staircase felt different at 3 a.m. than it had in daylight the week before. Our flashlight beams throwing long, shifting shadows up the granite walls with every step, the ordinary creak and give of old iron treads sounding, in that particular silence, far louder than they had any right to sound. Frank went first, and me, then Dana bringing up the rear with her sidearm drawn, none of us discussing that choice directly, but none of us objecting to it either. The lamp room, when Frank and I climbed up to check it, direct against his own earlier caution, showed no sign at all of recent light, the mechanism cold, the glass no warmer than the surrounding night air, nothing to suggest a lamp had been burning inside that room within the past 30 minutes, let alone the sustained 30-minute rotation I had watched with my own eyes from 200 yards away. We found instead, on the small landing just outside the lamp room's door, a fresh set of footprints in the thin coating of gull guano and wind-blown grit that had accumulated on that unused stone floor over decades, human in size and general shape, but pressed into that grime with a depth and evenness that suggested weight distributed strangely. A gait that favored no particular foot, the way an ordinary walking person's gait naturally does, moving in a slow, perfectly even rhythm from the door toward the room's far window and back again, over and over, dozens of times, in a worn, repetitive path that could only have been made by someone or something pacing that same short stretch of floor for far longer than a single night could account for. Dana knelt beside that worn path for a long moment, tracing its edge with her flashlight beam without touching it, and asked quietly how many nights of pacing it would take to wear a path that deep into stone floor that had, by every official ashore that had, record, been undisturbed for 40 years. Nobody answered her. I don't think any of us had an answer that wouldn't have made the whole night considerably harder to get through. Frank stood over those tracks a long time without speaking, and when he finally did say something, it wasn't a theory or an explanation, just a quiet, flat statement that we were leaving now, and that Holloway Light was going to be formally condemned and scheduled for demolition, rather than left standing as an attractive nuisance for whatever had apparently been keeping it. The demolition took another 8 months to actually happen, tangled in the kind of bureaucratic delay that swallows even urgent-seeming decisions inside a large enough institution. But it did eventually happen. The following June. A controlled charge bringing down what remained of the tower in a single afternoon while our station's boat held well clear of the island, watching from a safe distance as 140 years of granite came down in a cloud of dust that the wind carried out to sea within minutes. Those 8 months of waiting were their own particular kind of strain, honestly. A stretch of the calendar where every station briefing included a standing item about Holloway's status. Every fog-bound morning carried an unspoken question none of us voiced directly about whether that light might be visible somewhere out in the murk if any of us happened to be looking the right direction. It never appeared again during that whole waiting period. Not once, not to any of the fishing boats or research vessels, or our own patrol runs that passed within sight of the island regularly enough that a light would almost certainly have been noticed. I've wondered since whether that stillness meant it was waiting, patient, for the demolition it must somehow have understood was coming. Or whether whatever had kept that light simply understood, after that second night, that it had already been seen clearly enough and had no further reason to perform. Curtis Meade, when I ran into him at the harbor sometime that winter, asked how the investigation had gone. Careful and a little hesitant the way people are when they suspect an honest answer might be stranger than the polite version they're prepared to accept. I told him what I could, which wasn't much, official channels being what they were. But I did tell him the tower was scheduled for demolition, and something in his face relaxed at that news in a way that told me he'd been carrying more worry about it than his easy dockside manner had let on. He said his grandfather would have found that a hard thing to hear, a lighthouse that had kept ships safe for over a century finally coming down for good, but that he thought, on balance, his grandfather would have understood why. I was on that boat the day of the demolition. I watched the whole thing, and I want to tell you honestly that I expected, right up until the tower actually fell, some kind of visible response. A light, a sound, something that would confirm, one way or another, what exactly we'd been dealing with all those months before. Nothing came. The tower simply fell, the dust cleared, and Holloway Island settled into an ordinary permanent silence that has held, as far as I know, in all the years since. I left that station 2 years later, transferred to a busier post further south, closer to a town with actual streetlights and actual crowds. Work that felt after Holloway, like a relief in a way I hadn't expected office and paperwork duty to ever feel. I still work Coast Guard. Still love the water in the way you love something that's tried, at least once, to show you exactly how little you understand about it. I don't go north anymore, not even on personal trips, not even for the lobster rolls that stretch of coast is famous for among people who've never had reason to think twice about a dark, empty lighthouse rising out of the fog. Dana, the last I heard, still works that same original station, and we exchange a card most Decembers, brief, ordinary updates that never once mention Holloway directly, though there's always a line in hers, some small variation on the same sentiment, wishing me a quiet winter, a phrase I understand now means something different between the two of us than it would mean to anyone else reading it. Frank retired the year after the demolition, a decision he'd apparently been considering for a while, but that final season out there seemed to settle for good, the same way it settled things for so many of us who lived through it in one capacity or another. I ran into him once, years later, at a maritime safety conference in Portland, and we talked for a while about ordinary things, current postings, mutual acquaintances, before he mentioned, almost in passing, that he still thought about that logbook. Sometimes that particular entry about the ship in the storm, and wondered aloud whether whatever kept that light had ever really stopped caring about the job even after the tower itself was gone. I didn't have an answer for him. I don't think he expected one. Sometimes, on foggy mornings at my current post, watching mist roll in low across water I can no longer see the bottom of, I catch myself waiting for a light that has no business appearing anywhere near this coastline. Some old, careful watchfulness. That followed me south along with everything else Holloway left me carrying. It never comes. But I keep watching for it anyway. The way you keep checking a lock you're already certain you turned. If you've ever stood on open water at night and felt, for even a moment, that the dark out past your own running lights was watching back rather than simply being empty, you already know exactly the kind of quiet I'm describing. The kind that isn't fog and isn't distance and isn't anything the chart. My name is Casey Doyle, and for 9 years I worked Wildland Fire. Most of that time as a squad boss on a Type 2 initial attack crew based out of a ranger district straddling the Bitterroot country between Montana and Idaho. I want to tell you about the Widow Creek fire, the one that ended my time on backcountry cruise for good. And about 4 days in August when I learned that fire, which every part of my training told me behaved according to fuel and slope and wind, could apparently choose to behave according to something else entirely. I'll start with the job because understanding fire behavior is the whole foundation of staying alive doing this work. Wildland firefighting isn't what people picture from the news footage of walls of flame racing toward houses. Most of the actual job, especially on backcountry fires far from any structure, is slower and more methodical than that. Building line, cutting fuel breaks, burning out sections deliberately to rob a fire of what it needs to keep spreading. All of a fire of what it needs to keep spreading. It governed by a body of fire behavior science that predicts, with real reliability, how flame moves through different fuel types under different conditions. Fire runs uphill faster than downhill. Fire moves with wind, not against it. Fire in heavy timber behaves differently than fire in grass or brush. You learn these principles in training, and then you learn them again, more permanently. The first time you watch a fire actually do exactly what the models predicted it would do, and understand that the model just kept your crew alive. Every rookie firefighter learns, early, about the handful of historical fires where crews died specifically because fire behavior did something the crew hadn't anticipated. A wind shift nobody caught in time. A fuel type that burned faster than dawn. Expected terrain that channeled flame in a direction the escape route hadn't accounted for. Those incidents get studied exhaustively in training precisely because the entire safety culture of wildland fire depends on being able to predict, with real confidence, what a fire is going to do next. You don't fight fire by matching its power. You fight it by understanding it well enough to always be one step ahead of where it's going, and every safety margin, every escape route, every trigger point for retreat gets built on the assumption that fire behaves according to knowable physical rules. I spent 9 seasons trusting that science completely, working fires across 3 states, has seen crown fires crest ridgelines and spot fires, jump highways and every other dramatic, dangerous thing a wildfire can legitimately do. None of it had ever once behaved in a way that contradicted the basic physics everyone on a fire line depends on to make life or death decisions in real time. The Widow Creek fire started that August from a lightning strike in a remote drainage of the Bitterroot backcountry, a stretch of steep, heavily timbered wilderness, maybe 18 miles from the nearest road, the kind of terrain that meant our crew would be working out of a spike camp rather than commuting in each day, sleeping on the ground near the fire's edge for the duration of the assignment, resupplied by helicopter every few days. That particular stretch of Bitterroot backcountry sees dozens of lightning-caused starts most seasons, most of them small, most of them either extinguished naturally by weather or contained quickly by initial attack crews before they grow beyond a few acres. Widow Creek's start was, in every early report, entirely unremarkable. A single strike during a dry lightning storm that passed through without accompanying rain, catching in duff and down timber, the way lightning starts commonly do, growing over its first day into a fire large enough to warrant a full Type 2 response, rather than a quick initial attack. But nothing in those first reports suggested anything beyond an ordinary, if serious, backcountry fire assignment. I remember the initial dispatch briefing, standard and procedural, fire size estimate, expected weather, terrain, and fuel type summary, resource assignments. Nothing in any of it hinting at what those next several days would actually hold. What? Ray ran through the briefing with his usual efficient thoroughness, and our crew loaded gear onto the trucks that would carry us as far as the trailhead before we shouldered packs for the remaining miles on foot. An ordinary start to what looked. Paper, like an ordinary assignment. I want to describe that drainage because the terrain itself matters to understanding how the fire's strange behavior first became noticeable. Widow Creek ran through a narrow valley flanked by steep, north-facing slopes still holding old-growth Douglas fir, the kind of dense, shaded timber that burns differently than the drier lodgepole stands more typical of that country. Heavier fuel loads, cooler microclimates, moisture retained in duff and understory that usually meant fires moved slower and cooler through those specific stands than through the surrounding forest. Our crew moved in on the second day of the fire's growth, assigned to hold a section of line along the drainage's eastern flank, working alongside two other crews spread across the fire's growing perimeter under the direction of an incident command team that had, by that point, classified Widow Creek as a Type 2 complex serious enough to warrant real resources, but nowhere near the scale of the massive headline fires that sometimes burn through that region in a bad season. Setting up Spike Camp that first evening had the familiar rhythm of a routine our crew had run dozens of times before. Tents pitched in a clearing well back from any active flame, a rough kitchen area established near the small creek that gave the soul. Fire its name, gear laid out and checked in the fading light with the particular efficiency that comes from doing the same physical tasks together, season after season, until they require almost no conscious thought at all. Our crew of 16 had worked together, in various combinations, for enough seasons that the whole operation had a settled, practiced quality to it even under genuinely difficult conditions. Jokes passed back and forth over the evening meal. The ordinary camaraderie that makes physically brutal, dangerous work bearable over a full season. The first 2 days went almost exactly as the fire behavior analysts' models predicted. Steady growth on the southern flank where wind and slope aligned to push flame uphill through drear fuels, slower, more manageable behavior on our eastern end section, where the terrain and fuel type should have kept things cooler. We built line, held it, watched the fire do what fires in that terrain were supposed to do. It started on the third day, in the late afternoon, with a report from our crew's lookout, a sharp, careful firefighter named Priya Anand, who'd been posted on a ridge with a clear sight line down into the drainage, specifically to watch for exactly the kind of dangerous, unpredictable fire behavior that gets crews killed when nobody catches it early enough. Priya had worked lookout duty for our crew for 3 seasons by that point, methodical and precise in a way that made her reports reliable in a job where reliable reporting genuinely saves lives. And I want to emphasize that because what she radioed down that afternoon carried none of the uncertainty or hedging a less experienced spotter might have added to a report that strange. She described the fire's western edge, along a stretch of slope that should have been burning downhill and away from our position given the day's wind pattern, creeping instead uphill against that same wind. Slow but unmistakable. And she gave us her compass bearing and rate of spread with the same flat, professional precision she'd have used to report any ordinary fire behavior update. I remember standing near our crew's small forward staging area when that call came through, watching Ray's face as he listened, the particular stillness of an experienced supervisor doing rapid mental math on a piece of information that didn't fit anywhere in his existing framework. He asked Priya to confirm the wind direction at her position twice, a request that told me, even before he'd said anything to the rest of us, that he was hoping for a simple answer. A local wind shift? An equipment error? Anything that would let the report resolve into something ordinary. Her confirmation came back unchanged both times. I want to be precise about what that report actually meant to a crew like ours, because I think it's easy for people who haven't worked fire to underestimate how seriously wrong information like that gets treated. Fire behavior isn't just an academic interest on a fire line. It's the single piece of information every safety decision depends on: where to build line, where crews can safely work, which direction to retreat if something goes wrong. A fire moving in a way the models didn't predict wasn't just strange. It was immediately and directly dangerous, because it meant our whole framework for staying safe around that fire had just become unreliable in a way none of us had a protocol for. Our crew superintendent, a steady, exacting man named Ray Cordero, who'd worked fire for over 20 years, ordered an immediate reassessment of our position, pulling us back from the section of line closest to that anomalous western edge while he radioed the anomaly up to Incident Command for the fire behavior analyst to review. I watched him make that call from close enough to hear both sides of the conversation, Ray's voice carrying the flat, careful precision of someone reporting something he already suspected wouldn't have a satisfying answer, describing the bearing, the rate of spread, the wind conditions at Priya's position, all of it laid out with the same procedural thoroughness he'd have used for any ordinary incident update, nothing in his tone giving away, to anyone who didn't know him well, how unusual he he didn't know him well, clearly found what he was describing. The analyst's response, relayed back to us within the hour, was cautious but not alarmed. Anomalous fire behavior does occur, she explained, sometimes driven by localized wind effects. The broader models don't fully capture terrain channeling or thermal columns that can temporarily push fire against the prevailing gradient in ways that usually correct themselves within hours. It was a reasonable, professionally sound explanation, the kind that let Incident Command keep managing the fire under its existing plan, rather than treating a single anomalous report as evidence that something fundamental had changed. I wanted to believe that explanation completely. I want to be honest about how badly I wanted it to be true, because the alternative, that something about this particular fire simply didn't follow the rules the rest of my career had been built on, wasn't a thought I had any real framework for, holding on to and still doing my job effectively the next morning. That evening, back at Spike Camp, the crew's conversation over dinner stayed carefully, deliberately ordinary. The kind of studied normalcy people fall into when everyone privately wants to discuss something and has silently agreed, without everyone privately wants to discuss something, and has silently agreed, saying so, not to. Priya joined us at the fire once her lookout shift ended, quieter than her usual self, and I noticed more than one crew member glance her way throughout the meal, the unspoken question of whether she'd seen anything further hanging over the whole gathering without anyone actually asking it aloud. The fourth day started ordinary enough, crew moving back into position along a reassessed section of line, once the western edge's anomalous creep had, apparently, corrected itself overnight, holding steady in a pattern that matched the models again. By the time we resumed work at dawn, I let myself relax, working through the morning's line building with a kind of focused physical attention that the job demands and that leaves very little room for dwelling on yesterday's strangeness. The work itself that morning was genuinely satisfying in the ordinary way good fireline work always is, clearing brush and down timber along our assigned section, cutting a break wide enough to hold if the fire's edge reached it, the crew moving through the familiar choreography of chainsaws and hand tools that 9 seasons had made almost automatic. I remember, at one point mid-morning, actually laughing at something a crew member said, a small, ordinary moment of levity that felt, in hindsight, like the last genuinely light moment any of us had for several days afterward. We broke for lunch around noon in a small clearing well back from the active line. The kind of routine midday pause that happens on every fire assignment, regardless of how strange the surrounding circumstances might be, because bodies doing that kind of physical labor need the fuel, regardless of what else is happening. Conversation stayed light, deliberately so, nobody bringing up the previous day's anomalous fire behavior directly, though I noticed more than one person glance toward the drainage's western slope during the pauses in conversation, a habit I caught myself doing too, some part of every one of us apparently keeping half an eye on that section, even while the rest of us focused on ordinary tasks. It was early afternoon when Priya's voice came over the radio again, tighter this time, describing something that none of the crew's collective decades of fire experience had a ready explanation for. A section of the fire's edge, well within the old-growth Douglas fir stand on the drainage's shaded north slope, burning with an intensity and rate of spread that belonged, by every rule any of us knew, to dry grass or brush rather than heavy, moisture-retaining timber, moving fast enough that she'd lost visual on a section of line in under 10 minutes that should have taken hours to burn through under any normal conditions. I made the climb up to a secondary vantage point myself once Ray gave the order, wanting to see the anomaly directly rather than rely entirely on radio description, and what I found through my own binoculars matched Priya's account in every unsettling detail. The flames moving through that shaded, moisture-heavy stand carried none of the slower, sullen quality that kind of timber normally produces, instead racing through crown and understory alike with a speed and intensity that belonged to a completely different fuel type. The kind of fire behavior you'd expect from a wind-driven grass fire on an open, dry slope rather than old-growth fir soaking in shade and duff moisture. The smoke column rising off that section had a strange, tight coherence to it, too, rising almost straight up despite a crosswind that should have bent it visibly to one side, a detail I noted and photographed without fully understanding, in the photo moment, how much that particular observation would matter later. Ray pulled the whole crew back immediately, invoking one of the fundamental safety principles drilled into every wildland firefighter from their first season. When fire behavior stops making sense, you don't wait for an explanation before retreating. You retreat first and sort out the explanation later because the alternative has killed experienced crews before. I want to give you a moment of the ordinary here, because even inside a genuinely dangerous, disorienting few days, most of the actual hours were still filled with the physical, exhausting, procedural work fire crews always do. Hauling gear, cutting line, eating simple meals at Spike Camp each evening. The kind of bone-deep tired that usually made sleep come fast and dreamless, despite whatever strangeness the day had held. That fourth night, though, sleep didn't come easily for most of the crew. Spike Camp set up in a small cleared area well back from the fire's active edge, close enough to hear its low, constant roar carried on the night air, the ordinary background presence of a working fire that most of us had long since learned to sleep through without difficulty. That night, several crew members mentioned, comparing notes the next morning, that the fire sound had seemed to shift at some point well after midnight. Not louder exactly, but different in quality. A low, rhythmic pulsing underneath the ordinary crackle and roar that several people described, independently, and without having discussed it with each other first, as sounding almost like breathing. I heard it myself, lying awake in my sleeping bag sometime around 2 a.m, that same slow, pulsing rhythm underneath the fire's constant sound, close enough in cadence to actual breath that some old deep part of my brain kept trying to match it to a size, an actual set of lungs large enough to produce a sound like that. A thought I pushed away as quickly as it arrived, because there was no useful place for it to go. I lay there a long time listening to it, unwilling to get up and check on anything, unwilling also to fully close my eyes and let myself drift toward sleep while that rhythm continued underneath the fire's ordinary noise. The night air carried, along with the usual smoke, something else I hadn't noticed before that particular night. A faint, sweetish undertone beneath the char and pine resin smell every fire produces, gone as quickly as I registered it whenever the wind shifted even slightly, present again the moment it settled back. I found myself, at some point past 3, doing the same mental arithmetic Priya's radio reports had already forced on the whole crew, trying to reconcile a phenomenon that behaved like breath with a physical process I understood, with complete and Confidence to be nothing more than oxidizing carbon and hydrogen, chemistry with no lungs anywhere inside it. I never did fall fully asleep that night. I don't think I was alone in that, judging by how many of the crew looked that following morning, quiet over breakfast in a way that had nothing to do with the ordinary fatigue of physical work. The fifth day, the day that ended, for practical purposes, my time on backcountry cruise, started with a spot fire report that made no sense given the wind conditions at the time. Spot fires happen when embers, carried on wind or convective updraft, land beyond the main fire's edge and ignite new, separate points of fire, a normal and expected part of wildfire behavior that crews watch for constantly. What Priya reported that morning was a spot fire igniting nearly half a mile beyond the main fire's perimeter, in a direction that ran directly against that morning's wind, in terrain that offered no plausible convective mechanism for carrying an ember that distance against the prevailing air movement. I remember the specific quality of the silence on the radio channel after she gave that report. A beat long enough that another crew member working the line beside me quietly asked whether the transmission had cut out. It hadn't. Ray simply hadn't responded right away, and when he did, his voice carried a controlled steadiness I recognized as the particular calm experienced supervisors adopt specifically when the situation underneath that calm is anything but steady. Ray radioed it up immediately, and this time, the fire behavior analyst's response carried a different tone than her earlier. Measured reassurance. She confirmed the report matched nothing in any standard fire behavior model, requested additional aerial reconnaissance, and recommended, pending that reconnaissance, that all ground crews pull back to a significantly wider safety margin than the fire's official size currently warranted. We pulled back. I remember that retreat clearly, moving as a full crew along a predetermined escape route we'd identified and rehearsed on our very first day on that fire. Standard procedure that suddenly felt considerably less routine given everything that had built up over the preceding 2 days. We moved fast but controlled, the same disciplined pace we'd trained for. Gear secured, spacing maintained. Nobody breaking formation despite what I could see. In more than one face around me was a genuine, private fear that none of the crews. Professionalism fully masked. The fire sound followed us longer than it should have, given the distance we were putting between ourselves and its actual edge. That same low, pulsing undertone carrying further than sound from an ordinary fire had any business carrying. Fading. Only gradually rather than dropping away the way distance should have made it drop. Aerial reconnaissance that afternoon, flown once weather cleared enough to permit it safely, produced images and thermal data that Ray shared with the full crew that evening. Images that showed, unmistakably, a section of the fire's perimeter burning, in a pattern that formed something close to a deliberate, curved arc rather than the irregular, fuel and wind-driven edge every other section of that fire displayed. A shape that no incident commander or fire behavior analyst present had ever seen a genuine wildfire produced before. In decades of collective experience among people whose entire careers were built on understanding exactly how fire moves. Ray pulled up the thermal imagery on a laptop screen in our Spike Camp's small command area. The whole crew gathered around in a loose half-circle, headlamps clicking off one by one as everyone's attention fixed on that pale, false-color image, showing heat signatures across the burn. The arc was unmistakable once you knew to look for it. A smooth, continuous curve running through terrain with wildly different fuel types and slope angles. The kind of consistency that should have been geometrically impossible given how differently fire moves through timber versus open ground versus creek bottom, all of which that curve passed through without the slightest deviation in its shape. Nobody on that call offered an explanation. I remember the specific quality of silence that followed those images being shared. A room, or in our case a Spike Camp clearing, full of experienced professionals all independently arriving at the same unspoken conclusion. That whatever we were, looking at wasn't operating according to any physics any of us had ever been trained to predict, and that the safest, most responsible course of action was to treat it exactly the way you'd treat any other unpredictable hazard, with maximum caution and maximum distance, rather than trying to force an explanation onto data that plainly refused to fit one. One of the younger crew members, a firefighter named Marcus, who'd only worked 2 full seasons, asked the question I think most of us were quietly holding back: whether anyone had ever seen anything like this before, on any other fire, anywhere. Ray didn't answer right away. When he did, he said only that in over 20 years of fire, he hadn't, and that he intended to keep it that way going forward. A statement that carried underneath its flat, professional delivery more weight than I think he fully intended to show a crew he was responsible for keeping calm. Incident Command made the call that evening to shift the entire fire's management strategy from active suppression to full containment from a significant defensive perimeter, essentially surrendering the anomalous interior sections of the burn to fire while focusing every available resource on protecting the wider area from further spread. It was, functionally, an admission that direct engagement with that particular fire had become too unpredictable to safely continue, though the official incident reports, when I later read them, described the decision in more measured, procedurally, language that made no direct reference to anything my crew and I had actually witnessed. Our crew relocated to a new spike camp position that same night, well outside the widened safety perimeter, close enough to a forest road that a vehicle evacuation was possible, if conditions demanded it. A comfort none of us had needed to think about. At our previous, deeper position, the relocation itself took most of the remaining daylight, breaking down camp and hauling gear over rough terrain, with the particular grim efficiency of people who badly wanted to be somewhere else before dark. That first night at the new position was quieter, in every sense, than any of the previous nights had been, far enough now that the fire's sound had faded to a distant, indistinct murmur, rather than the close, constant presence it had been at our tier. Original camp, no trace of that unsettling breathing rhythm reaching us across the new distance. I slept, that night, more deeply than I had in days, and I remember waking the next morning almost disoriented by how ordinary everything felt. Birds working the trees around our new camp, sunlight falling normal and unremarkable through the canopy. The whole previous week beginning to take on the strange, unreal quality that genuinely frightening experiences sometimes acquire once you're safely clear of them. Ray called the crew together that second morning at the new position, not for any operational briefing, but simply, he said, to check in, to ask directly whether anyone needed to talk through what we'd all witnessed before we got back to the ordinary business of fire containment work. It wasn't the kind of thing crew superintendents typically did, and I think all of us understood, without him needing to say it explicitly, that he was as unsettled by the preceding days as any of us. However carefully his professional composure had held throughout. The fire burned for another 11 days under that revised strategy before a shift in weather finally brought enough moisture to slow its spread significantly. And full containment was declared 3 weeks after that, a fire that ultimately consumed just under 9,000 acres of backcountry wilderness, unremarkable in scale by the standards of a bad fire season, entirely remarkable in every other respect to everyone who'd actually worked its line. Our crew rotated back onto the fire for mop-up work in its final week. Standard procedure once containment holds and active suppression gives way to the slower, more tedious job of extinguishing remaining hotspots and clearing hazard trees before an area can be declared fully controlled. I'd requested, quietly, to be assigned anywhere but the drainage's north-facing slope, and Ray, without needing an explanation, arranged our crew's section accordingly, though mop-up work on a fire that size eventually required every crew to cover ground across the whole burn scar before the assignment closed out. It was during that final week, working a section not far from where the anomalous curved arc had shown up on the thermal imagery weeks before, that another crew member, a firefighter named Deja Whitfield, called the rest of us over to something she'd Deja Whitfield found while checking hotspots along the forest floor. At the center of a stretch of ground burned as thoroughly and completely as anything else in that section. Blackened duff, standing trees reduced to charred snags, the ordinary total devastation a hot burn leaves behind, sat a rough circle of hide. Forest floor, perhaps 20 feet across, entirely untouched by fire. Green understory still standing inside that circle's boundary, moss still soft and damp underfoot. A scattering of unburned pine needles carpeting ground that should have, by every physical law governing how fire moves through continuous fuel, burned along with everything immediately surrounding it. I stood at the edge of that circle a long time, closer to it than I'd gotten to any of the fire's other anomalies over the preceding weeks, close enough to see the boundary itself, a line so clean and precise it looked almost drawn rather than that. Burned, ash and char on one side, transitioning to living green on the other within the space of a single inch. No scorching, no singed edges, no gradual transition of any kind that ordinary fire behavior would have produced even under the most unusual wind or fuel conditions. Within that untouched circle, pressed into the soft, undisturbed moss, ran a single worn path, curving in a slow, deliberate loop around the circle's inner perimeter. Moss compressed and darkened along that narrow track in a pattern that could only have been made by something walking that same loop, over and over, enough times to leave a lasting impression in ground that fire itself had somehow declined to touch at all. Deja asked quietly whether any of us had a theory. Nobody did. She stood at the circle's edge a long moment after asking, her own headlamp beam tracing that worn looping path in the moss, and said, almost to herself, that it reminded her of something her grandmother used to describe, some old story from her own childhood about places in deep woods that fire and axe alike seemed to pass over out of a kind of respect, or caution, she couldn't fully remember which. She didn't offer more than that, and nobody asked her to. The vague, half-remembered fragment, somehow feeling more appropriate to the moment than any fuller explanation would have. Ray photographed the circle extensively, logged its coordinates for the official incident record, and gave the order, without further discussion, that our crew would finish mop-up on every other section of that drainage before circling back, if at all, to that particular stretch of ground. We never did circle back. The assignment closed out 3 days later with that section still unexamined beyond Ray's initial photographs, a gap in the official record that nobody on our crew ever pushed to fill. I thought about that circle more than almost anything else from that whole assignment, more even than the breathing sound or the impossible curved arc the aerial imagery had shown. There was something about its stillness, its careful, deliberate preservation in the middle of 9,000 acres of total devastation that felt less like an anomaly and more like a message, though I've never been able to settle on what exactly that message might have been, or who, or what it might have been meant for. I finished that season, filed my own account of what our crew had witnessed as accurately and factually as I could manage, and requested reassignment the following year to a structure protection unit, work that keeps firefighters closer to towns and roads, further from the kind of deep backcountry spike camps that had defined most of my previous 9 seasons. My superintendent, Ray, made a similar request around the same time, taking a position with a regional training program instead of returning to Fireline Command. I remember the conversation where I told Ray I was requesting the transfer, sitting in the district office in the weeks after the season ended, the whole Widow Creek assignment already starting to feel, in the ordinary daylight of an administrative building, like something that belonged more to memory than to the kind of thing you could describe plainly in a transfer request form. He didn't ask me to elaborate beyond what I'd already put in writing, didn't push for the kind of detail neither of us particularly wanted to revisit out loud in an office with other staff moving through the hallway outside. He just nodded, signed the paperwork, and told me he thought it was a sound decision professionally, the same careful, measured language he'd have used for any ordinary career move. Though something in the way he said it told me he understood exactly what was actually driving the request. We've spoken a handful of times since, always briefly. Always circling the actual subject without quite landing on it directly, the way people who've shared something they can't fully explain often do. He mentioned once, on one of those calls, that he still thought about that curved, deliberate arc the aerial imagery had shown, and wondered aloud whether wildland fire, over enough acres and enough decades, might occasionally develop something closer to a genuine patient intelligence than any of the physics-based models accounted for. I didn't have an answer for him then, and I still don't now. Priya left backcountry lookout work entirely the following season, moving into a fire behavior analyst role herself, working from incident command centers rather than remote ridgelines. A transition, she told me once. Over drinks at a training conference. She'd started seriously considering the moment she gave that first report about fire moving against the wind, and heard her own voice come out steadier than she actually felt. She's good at the analyst work, from what I've heard secondhand, methodical and thorough, and exactly the way you'd want from someone reviewing fire behavior data for a living, though she's also, according to a mutual friend still working active crews, developed something of a reputation for flagging anomalous reports for closer review rather than defaulting to the standard explanations the rest of the profession tends to reach for first. I still work wildland fire technically, though structure protection is a very different job than backcountry initial attack. Closer to towns, closer to roads, rarely more than an hour from a paved escape route in any direction. I like it well enough. I've made my peace with the fact that some part of the work I used to love, the deep backcountry assignments, the total isolation of a remote spike camp, isn't something I'm willing to do again, whatever practical arguments I could make to myself about statistics and probability and how genuinely rare that one fire's behavior actually was. The work itself still has real satisfaction to it, even scaled down from what I used to do. Protecting an actual home, an actual family's belongings, from an advancing fire line carries its own concrete, immediate reward. That backcountry initial attack, for all its physical intensity, never quite offered in the same direct way. I've made peace with that trade, mostly. I don't miss the deep isolation of a 9-day spike camp assignment the way I once thought I would. The way younger crew members sometimes describe missing it when they transitioned to less remote work. I still listen to fire differently than I used to, even from a safe distance, on assignments that never come close to matching what Widow Creek put my crew through. I catch myself, some evenings on a quiet section of line, listening past the ordinary crackle and roar for that low, pulsing undertone. That particular rhythm that several of us heard independently in the dark, that one August night, and never fully agreed afterward on how to describe to anyone who hadn't heard it themselves. It's never there. Every fire I've worked since has sounded exactly the way fire is supposed to sound. But I keep listening for it anyway. The way you keep checking a smoke detector's battery long after any reasonable person would consider the precaution excessive. There's a particular moment, most shifts, standing close enough to an active fire line to feel real heat against my face, when I catch myself doing an old, unconscious check I never used to do before that August, listening, just for a second or two, past the ordinary sound of burning fuel, confirming to myself, consciously, that what I'm hearing is exactly what it should be, and nothing more. It always is. I do the check anyway, every single time, a small, private ritual that has become, over the years since, simply part of how I work fire now. No more remarkable to me at this point than checking my gear or confirming my escape route. Just one more habit this job has quietly built into me. If you've ever stood close enough to a wildfire to feel its heat on your face and hear its full, constant roar, you already know that a fire like that has a presence to it. A kind of physicality that feels, on some old animal level, almost alive. What I learned that August is that sometimes, in ways no fire behavior model has ever accounted for, it apparently can be. When you work for the United States Forest Service long enough, you learn that the wilderness has a heartbeat. It is not something they teach you at the academy in Oregon, nor is it written in any of the standard operating procedures issued by the Department of Agriculture. You learn it slowly, through hundreds of solitary hours spent behind the wheel of a green pickup truck, or on foot along trails that haven't seen a crew of trail maintainers in 15 years. My name is Thomas Vance. I spent 12 years as a backcountry park ranger in the Black Ridge District, a dense swath of old-growth timber tucked deep within the Pacific Northwest. Black Ridge covers nearly 400,000 acres of rugged terrain, steep valleys carved by glacial runoff, jagged granite ridges, and stands of Douglas fir and western red cedar so thick that the forest floor remains in perpetual twilight even at high noon. For the first 8 years of my career, I considered myself a strict pragmatist. I was the guy who laughed at the local campfire legends told by hunters in town. When tourists came to the station asking about strange lights near the ridge or mysterious calls echoing through the timber late at night, I gave them the standard official explanations. It was always a temperature inversion reflecting highway headlights, or a screech owl, or a mountain lion in heat. I believed in topographic maps, secondary search grids, radio repeaters, and solid logistics. The forest was simply trees, dirt, weather, and wildlife. Nothing more, nothing less. But the wilderness is indifferent to human logic. It does not care about your training, your gear, or your skepticism. It was late September of my 9th year at Black Ridge. The summer tourist season had effectively wound down. The campgrounds along the river were empty. The seasonal staff had been laid off for the winter, and the district was quiet. The air had turned sharp and damp, carrying that heavy scent of wet pine resin, dying ferns, and cold earth that always signals the coming of the autumn rains. Most of my daily routine consisted of solo patrols, checking remote trailheads, securing winterized cabins, and verifying that no lingering backcountry campers were setting illegal fires during the wind-dry season. It was supposed to be my final long-range patrol before the upper pass was closed by snow. A 5-day circuit through Sector 7, the most isolated quarter of the park. Sector 7 is a black hole for radio signals, a place where the mountains pinch together to block the repeaters and where the trees grow so tall and dense that even satellite signals struggle to penetrate the canopy. I knew the risks of going in alone, but after nearly a decade in the woods, I was comfortable with the silence. I packed my standard loadout, verified my check-in schedule with dispatch, and drove my patrol truck to the end of the gravel logging road. I didn't know it then, but when I stepped off that gravel road and into the shadow of the trees, I was leaving the world I understood behind. The assignment came in on a Tuesday morning over the crackling radio speaker in my station office. Dispatch called with a routine request from the Regional Wildlife Office. A commercial survey team mapping timberlines near the boundary of Sector 7 had reported unusual damage to several stands of cedar. They noted large sections of bark stripped away at impossible heights and odd structural timber piles that looked man-made, but sat miles away from any designated trail or access road. I cleared my desk, loaded my pack into the back of the government truck, and headed out toward the boundary. The drive took 2 hours down main forestry roads, followed by 45 minutes on an abandoned logging spur that rattled the teeth out of my jaw. By the time I cut the truck engine at the trailhead, the sky had turned a flat, bruising shade of slate gray. High-altitude clouds were rolling in from the coast, bringing the first real chill of the season, The air outside the cab was 42 degrees. It hit my lungs with a crisp, wet sting. I pulled on my heavy canvas work coat, checked the battery on my handheld radio, and adjusted the strap of my service pack. The silence of Sector 7 hit me the moment I shut the truck door. Normally, even late in the year, you hear the background hum of the woods, the wind moving through the upper canopy, Douglas squirrels chattering high in the branches, or the occasional raven calling across the valley. Here, there was nothing. The forest was dead still. I began my hike along the old boundary trail, a path that had not been cleared since the late 90s. Ferns grew shoulder-high in the drainages, and fallen hemlock logs forced me to detour every 100 yards. I kept my head down, watching my footing on the slick moss, relying on my compass and paper topo map as the tree canopy thickened above me, blocking out the gray light of the sky. After nearly 3 hours of steady climbing, I reached the approximate coordinates given by the timber crew. The landscape changed dramatically. The steep grade leveled off into a broad, bowl-shaped depression surrounded by towering ridges. The timber here was ancient, trees 4 to 6 feet in diameter, their trunks rising 50 feet before reaching the first branches. That was where I found the first anomaly. I smelled it before I saw it. The air in the bowl smelled distinctly of fresh copper and crushed pine needles, a metallic, sharp scent that didn't belong in the damp forest air. I slowed my pace, resting my hand instinctively on the belt holster of my sidearm. 50 yards ahead, a circle of 6 massive western red cedars stood stripped of their bark. This was not the work of bears sharpening their claws or porcupines feeding on the cambium layer. The bark had been removed cleanly, in long uniform vertical ribbons from the ground, up to a height of nearly 16 feet. No animal in the Pacific Northwest could reach 16 feet off the ground without leaving deep claw marks in the soft wood underneath. The exposed wood beneath was bone white, freshly bare, and glistening with sticky sap. In the center of this ring of stripped trees sat a structure. It was a lean-to shelter, but calling it a lean-to feels entirely inadequate. It was roughly 8 feet tall and 12 feet wide, constructed entirely of freshly cut cedar branches, green saplings, and heavy logs. But there were no axe marks on any of the wood. The ends of the thick branches were not chopped or sawed. They were twisted and snapped, folded over like wet paper straw. Even stranger was the weave. The saplings were interwoven so tightly that no light could pass through the walls. They were braided together in intricate, repetitive geometric patterns that defied any conventional wilderness survival technique I had ever been taught or seen in field guides. High up on the structure, living green branches from adjacent trees had been bent down at sharp, unnatural angles and woven directly into the roof, while still rooted in the canopy above. I stood at the edge of the clearing for several minutes, listening. The silence was absolute. My own breathing sounded unnaturally loud inside my ears. I unclipped my digital camera from my chest harness and stepped closer to document the sight. As I approached the entrance of the structure, a narrow triangular opening that forced a person to crouch low to look inside, I noticed something on the damp forest floor. The ground surrounding the weave was completely cleared of leaf litter, twigs, and pine cones. The dirt had been smoothed flat, almost polished, as if someone had swept it with a fine brush for hours. I crouched down, angling my flashlight beam into the dark interior of the woven shelter. The beam sliced through the gloom. The inside was empty, save for one single object sitting squarely in the middle of the smooth dirt floor. It was a small, leather-bound, waterproof notebook, stained with mud and mold, its pages swollen from humidity. I recognized the red nylon cover immediately. It was standard Forest Service issue. I reached out, wrapped my gloved fingers around the notebook, and pulled it into the light. The notebook belonged to a man named Arthur Pendleton. I knew the name immediately, and the realization sent a cold wave of adrenaline straight down my spine. Arthur Pendleton had been a senior wildlife biologist with the State Department. 4 years earlier, he had walked into Sector 7 to conduct an acoustic monitoring survey on northern spotted owls. He never walked out. The search for Pendleton had been one of the largest in the district's history. Search and rescue teams, National Guard helicopters, and specialized dog units spent 3 weeks combing every drain, ridge, and abandoned mine shaft in a 30-mile radius. They found his truck at the trailhead, but not a single piece of his gear, clothing, or equipment was ever recovered. The case had eventually gone cold, filed away in the cabinet back at the district office as an presumed accidental death due to exposure or animal attack. And here was his personal field log sitting inside a freshly built structure made of green wood that had been cut within the last 48 hours. My fingers trembled slightly as I flipped open the damp, warped cover. The first 50 pages were filled with Pendleton's precise, neat handwriting, daily temperature readings, owl call logs, weather conditions, and GPS coordinates from 4 years ago. But as I turned to the final entries, the handwriting broke down. The neat script deteriorated into jagged, hurried scrawls that filled the margins and crossed over previous entries. I read the final entry aloud to myself, just to hear a human voice in that suffocating quiet. It does not use the trails. It moves through the upper limbs. It imitates the wind when the wind isn't blowing. The radio repeater doesn't cut out. It records. It plays the voices back later. If you hear your own voice calling from the tree line, do not answer. It is building something. It wants. The text ended mid-sentence. The rest of the page was covered in deep, furious pencil marks. Long dark lines that had ripped straight through the damp paper. A sudden sound shattered the silence of the clearing. It wasn't a roar or a crash. It was a single, clean snap, like a dry timber branch. 3 inches thick, being broken over a knee. It came from the dense timber roughly 70 yards up the slope to my left. I snapped. The notebook closed, jammed it into my coat pocket, and unholstered my sidearm in one fluid motion. "Forest Service Ranger," I called out, trying to project a calm, authoritative authority I didn't feel. "Who's up there? Identify yourself." No answer. I waited, standing perfectly still, my eyes scanning the thick green wall of fir and hemlock. The forest offered no movement. The wind hadn't picked up. The leaves were completely motionless. I pulled my handheld radio from my shoulder clip, switched it to the emergency dispatch channel, and keyed the mic. "Dispatch, this is Ranger Vance. Sector 7 Boundary Patrol. I have located evidence related to a cold missing person case. Requesting secondary team and supervisor response to my location. Over." Static answered. Not the normal fuzz of a weak signal, but a rhythmic, pulsing static that hummed in 3-second intervals. Shh. Shh. Then, through the static speaker, a sound emerged that made the hair on the back of my neck stand straight up. It was a voice. It was faint, distorted by radio noise, but clear enough to understand. "Dispatch. This is Ranger Vance. Sector 7 Boundary Patrol. I have located evidence." It was my own voice. Not a broadcast from dispatch repeating my transmission, but an exact, pitch-perfect playback of the words I had spoken into the microphone less than 15 seconds ago. But the cadence was wrong. The gaps between my words had been stretched out, and the tone was completely flat, stripped of all human emotion. "Dispatch, do you copy?" I whispered into the mic, my thumb shaking on the push-to-talk button. The radio static pulsed again. "Do you copy?" My voice echoed back through the small plastic speaker, instantly, flatly, unnaturally. I unclipped the radio battery, killing the power completely, and shoved the useless plastic shell into my pack. The sun was dipping below the western ridge line now, and the twilight in the bowl was fading fast into deep shadow. I knew the cardinal rules of backcountry safety. You do not navigate rough, unmaintained terrain in Sector 7 after dark, especially when injured or disoriented. But staying near that woven shelter felt like standing in an open trap. I decided to head south toward a small, historic fire lookout cabin 2 miles away on Bald Ridge. The cabin was built of heavy timber, reinforced with steel cables anchored into the granite rock, and equipped with a wood stove and a heavy deadbolt door. If I could reach the lookout before dark, I could secure the structure and wait for daybreak. I turned away from the ring of stripped cedars and began to walk fast. 10 minutes into my hike, I realized I was no longer walking alone. The sun vanished completely behind the mountain range, plunging the forest into a deep, claustrophobic gloom. I pulled my tactical headlamp from my pack and switched it to medium beam, casting a cone of white lead light across the narrow, overgrown trail. The fog was rolling down from the high peaks now, thick and cold, sticking to the pine needles and reducing my visibility to less than 30 feet. The sound started behind me, kept at a precise, calculated distance. Every time my heavy boots crunched into the gravel or snapped a twig, an echoing crunch followed a fraction of a second later from the darkness off the left side of the trail. When I stopped, it stopped. When I sped up my pace, the footsteps matched my rhythm exactly. It wasn't an animal. Bears and cougars move through the backcountry with a fluid, silent efficiency. They do not stalk a human by mimicking their precise footfalls. Whatever was out there was heavy. The weight of it caused the damp soil to groan underfoot. A low, wet impact that I felt in the soles of my boots more than I heard in my ears. I am armed. I yelled into the fog, turning around and sweeping my flashlight beam through the thickets of salmonberry and devil's club. Back off! The light beam died against the wall of white fog and dark tree trunks. Nothing moved in the circle of light. Then came the smell again. That overwhelming metallic stench of fresh copper, mixed now with the sweet, sickening odor of rotting vegetation and ozone, like the air right before a severe lightning strike. I didn't run. Running in the woods at night is how you break an ankle, drop your gear, or run straight off a drop-off. I maintained a fast, deliberate pace, keeping my hand pressed firmly against the grip of my firearm, my head constantly spinning from side to side to check my flanks. At 8 o'clock, the dark silhouette of the Bald Ridge lookout cabin finally emerged from the fog. It sat high on a rocky outcrop, elevated 6 feet off the granite shelf on heavy timber stilts, its dark windows reflecting the beam of my headlamp. I took the wooden steps 3 at a time, shoved the cabin door open, threw myself inside, and slammed the heavy oak door shut. I immediately threw the thick iron deadbolt into place, dropping the wooden security bar into its heavy iron brackets. The cabin was freezing, the air inside stale and dry. I didn't dare turn on a lantern or light the wood stove. A flame would broadcast my exact position through the 4 large glass windows that wrapped around the lookout point. Instead, I crouched low beneath the window line, drew my weapon, and laid my extra magazine on the wooden floorboards beside me. For 20 minutes, there was only the sound of my own shallow breathing and the cold wind beginning to howl across the granite ridge outside. Then, the knocking started. It did not come from the door. It came from beneath the cabin. Thump. Day. Thump-I. Thump-I. 3 heavy, rhythmic strikes against the underside of the floorboards, directly beneath where I was crouching. Oh. The impacts were so powerful they vibrated up through the wood, through the soles of my boots, and into my spine. I scrambled backward, pressing my spine against the interior wall near the cold iron stove, aiming my handgun down at the floorboards. "Get out!" I screamed, my voice cracking slightly in the dark cabin. The knocking stopped instantly. Silence descended again, heavier this time, so dense it felt like a physical weight pressing down on my chest. The temperature inside the cabin plummeted suddenly. My breath began to billow out in thick, white plumes of fog, and frost began to form on the interior glass of the windows. Then the sound moved up. A slow, scraping noise began on the exterior wood siding of the cabin. Something was climbing the outer wall, moving smoothly, deliberately, without the heavy clatter of claws or boots. It moved up past the floor line, right to the corner window frame directly above my head. I slowly raised my head, angling my headlamp beam toward the glass. The fog outside pressed right against the window pane. But sitting just beyond the glass, hovering 6 feet above the wooden deck outside, was a shape. It did not have a defined face. It was a tall, narrow silhouette, wrapped in what looked like torn ribbons of dark, wet cedar bark. Where its head should have been, there was only a smooth, pale mass, reflecting the white lead light of my headlamp like wet bone. And then, from the other side of the glass, a speaker-like sound resonated through the wooden walls of the cabin. It was my own voice again, but it was no longer repeating my radio call. It was using sentences I had spoken years ago, fragments of personal conversations, pieces of training briefings, all spliced together into a horrifying, flat monologue. Thomas, check the perimeter. Sector 7 clear. Cold tonight. Very cold tonight. Stay inside, Thomas. Stay inside. The inflection was completely wrong. Words were chopped in half. Syllables stretched into long, unnatural moans. It sounded like a sound recording played at half speed through a broken speaker underwater. The shape raised a long, thin limb, an arm that appeared to have 3 joints, wrapped tightly in woven green vine and stripped bark, and pressed it flat against the window glass. The glass didn't break. It groaned under the pressure, fine hairline fractures spreading outward from the point of contact like a spider web. I didn't think. I raised my service pistol, aligned the sights with the center of the pale mass on the other side of the fractured glass, and pulled the trigger 3 times. The gunshots inside the enclosed timber cabin were deafening. The muzzle flashes illuminated the interior of the room in bright, violent bursts of orange light, casting long, distorted shadows against the back wall. The heavy glass window shattered, spraying fragments of safety glass inward across the floorboards. Cold air and thick mountain fog poured into the room through the broken pane. When the smoke cleared and the ringing in my ears began to fade into a high-pitched whine, the shape was gone. There was no sound of a body falling to the wooden deck outside. No sound of heavy footsteps retreating down the granite steps. No rustling in the dry bushes surrounding the ridge base. The space outside the broken window was empty, filled only with the swirling gray mist and the sound of the wind screaming across the peak. I remained crouching by the stove for the next 4 hours, my weapon raised, my eyes fixed on the shattered window frame. I did not move. I did not reload my flashlight. I did not check my watch. Every muscle in my body was locked in a state of absolute, instinctual terror. The cold was brutal. The temperature outside plummeted well below freezing, and cold mountain wind howled through the broken window, numbing my hands and feet until I could barely feel the trigger of my pistol. But the cold was a secondary concern. Every nerve in my brain was hyper-focused on the dark opening, waiting for that pale, bark-wrapped shape to reappear in the frame. It never did. At 5:30 in the morning, the dark sky outside began to shift into a dull, pale shade of pre-dawn gray. The dense fog began to lift off the ridge, blown away by a high-altitude northern wind. As soon as the light was sufficient to see the outline of the timber trail below, I stood up on stiff, aching legs. My knees buckled slightly from hours of remaining frozen in a crouch, but the surge of morning light gave me the raw momentum I needed to move. I unbolted the heavy door, stepped out onto the frost-covered wooden deck, and looked around. The deck was covered in a fine layer of white frost. Directly beneath the broken window, where the shape had stood, The frost was melted away in two clean, oval-shaped patches. Inside those patches, lying flat on the wooden planks, was a pile of wet, shredded cedar bark and a puddle of dark, thick liquid that had frozen solid in the night air. I didn't stop to take photos. I didn't stop to collect samples. I threw my pack over my shoulders, held my pistol drawn in my right hand, and ran down the steps. I hiked the 6 miles back to my patrol truck at a pace that bordered on suicidal. I tripped over exposed roots, slid down muddy embankments, and tore the sleeve of my heavy canvas coat on sharp hemlock branches. I didn't care. I kept my head down, my eyes fixed on the trail ahead, never once looking back into the dark timber stands on either side of the path. When I reached the logging spur, my truck sat exactly where I had left it, covered in a light dust of fallen pine needles. I practically threw myself into the cab, slammed the door, locked it, and shoved the key into the ignition. The engine cranked twice, sputtered, and caught with a loud roar. I threw the truck into reverse, spun the wheel, and drove back down the mountain, hitting every pothole and rock on that logging road at 40 miles an hour until the dense trees of Sector 7 finally gave way to the open, paved lanes of the state highway. Duh. I drove straight to the regional district office in town, skipping my own station entirely. When I walked into the chief ranger's office, disheveled, covered in mud, smelling of gunpowder and copper, holding Arthur Pendleton's damp notebook in my trembling hand, my supervisor, Captain Miller, took one look at me and closed his office door. I told him everything. I laid the field log on his desk, showed him the radio that had recorded my own voice, and detailed the encounter at the Bald Ridge Lookout cabin. Miller listened in total silence. He didn't interrupt, he didn't laugh, and he didn't call for a medical evaluation. He simply sat back in his leather chair, staring at the mud-stained red cover of Pendleton's notebook for a long, quiet minute. "Thomas," he said softly, his voice low and devoid of its usual sharp edge. "You're taking your accrued leave starting today. You're going to take 3 weeks off." "Captain, there's something out there," I said, my voice rising. "The structure, the stripped cedar, Pendleton's field log. It's all right there. We need a team up there right now." "A team went up to Sector 7 2 hours ago," Miller replied quietly, looking me dead in the eye. "A timber survey crew reported a fire signal near the boundary. We sent a crew up to investigate." He paused, leaning forward, placing his hands flat on his desk. "They found the lookout cabin, Thomas. The window was broken from the inside out. Your brass casings were on the floor. But there was no bark, no frozen liquid, no structure in the bowl, and no stripped cedar trees. They checked the coordinates you logged. The trees in that stand are 50 years old, and completely untouched." 2 days later, the official incident report was finalized. It cited severe fatigue, acute altitude, disorientation, and secondary carbon monoxide exposure from a faulty heater inside the patrol truck. My report regarding the woven structure, the stripped cedars, and the entity at the window was marked as an hallucinatory episode triggered by extreme physical stress and environmental factors. Arthur Pendleton's notebook was quietly logged into the regional cold case evidence locker, categorized as recovered property of unknown origin. I resigned from active backcountry field duty 4 months later. I transferred to an administrative desk job in district headquarters, 300 miles away from Black Ridge, taking a pay cut just to spend my working hours behind a desk in a carpeted office surrounded by fluorescent lights, ringing telephones, and concrete walls. It has been 7 years since that night in Sector 7. I have not set foot inside a national forest, state park, or wilderness area since the day I handed in my field gear. I don't go camping with my family. I don't take weekend hikes. I stay on paved roads, inside city limits, surrounded by streetlights, and the predictable, noisy hum of human civilization. Most days I can convince myself that Captain Miller was right. I tell myself that the altitude got to me, that the solitude of the backcountry played tricks on a tired brain, that the mind is capable of creating terrifying monsters out of fog, shadows, and exhaustion. But there are things that reason cannot erase. Every autumn, when the temperature drops to 42 degrees and the damp Pacific air carries that sharp scent of wet pine and cold earth into the city, my routine changes. I double-check the heavy deadbolts on my suburban front door. I pull down the window blinds before the sun goes down, making sure there is not a single gap of glass exposed to the dark backyard outside. And late at night, when the house is completely quiet and the rest of the neighborhood is asleep, I sit in my living room, listening. Sometimes, through the low hum of the refrigerator and the distant noise of highway traffic, I hear it. It is a faint, rhythmic sound against the exterior wall of my house, just beneath the living room windowsill. Thump. Thump. Dat. Thump. Why? 3 heavy, precise strikes against the wood. And then, softly, floating through the glass from the darkness outside, a voice speaks in the quiet suburban night. It uses my own voice, the exact tone, cadence, and inflection I used when I answered my phone at work 3 hours ago. Thomas, Administrative Services. How can I help you today? Stay inside, Thomas. Stay inside. I never go to the window. I never turn on the porch light. I just sit in the dark, hold my breath, and wait for the sun to rise. If you've ever worked these kinds of isolated backcountry places at night, if you've ever stood alone in the deep timber and felt that sudden, unnatural quiet fall over the trees, you already know the kind of silence I'm talking about. You know that the wilderness doesn't just hold secrets. Sometimes those secrets follow you home. If you spend enough years hanging from a static climbing rope in the middle of a blizzard, you stop thinking about mountain rescue as a heroic profession. Search and rescue is not what you see on television. There are no dramatic orchestral swells, no cinematic helicopter insertions through golden sunlight, and very rarely do you arrive in time to hear a survivor express their tearful gratitude. Most of the time, search and rescue is cold, damp, grinding labor. It is 8 hours of post-holing through chest-deep snowpack in the pitch black, carrying a 60-pound steel litter frame on your shoulders while your toes go numb inside your insulated boots. It is tracking the scent of diesel fuel and broken pine branches down a steep ravine, only to find an abandoned vehicle half buried in river silt. My name is Marcus Vance. For 14 years, I served as a team lead for the County Mountain Rescue Unit in the Sawtooth Range of central Idaho. The Sawtooths are some of the most unforgiving granite peaks in North America. They carve the skyline into jagged, razor-sharp teeth that rise over 10,000 feet above sea level, creating deep, sunless cirques and isolated valleys where snow remains lodged in the crevices until late July. During my career, I led over 200 missions. I pulled panicked college students out of lightning-swept granite saddles, recovered snowmobilers buried under 10 feet of avalanche debris, and spent days searching for solo backpackers who simply vanished off the face of the topographic map. You develop a thick skin for human tragedy in this line of work. You learn to compartmentalize horror, to treat a frozen corpse not as a person, but as a casualty package that needs to be secured, logged, and transported down the mountain before the weather turns. We were trained to trust our equipment and our protocols. We relied on heavy-duty handheld radios, double-braided synthetic ropes, infrared thermal imagers, GPS transceivers, and methodical grid searches. If a human being was lost on the mountain, they left a trace. They dropped a wrapper, snapped a willow twig, slipped in the mud, or bled on the granite. Everything in the wilderness leaves a signature. except for what we found on Deadwood Ridge in the late autumn of 2018. It was the final week of October, right at the knife edge of the season when autumn turns into a brutal, bitter winter. The high passes were already choked with 6 inches of fresh wind-blown ice, and the tourist season had completely died out. The county had officially suspended all routine wilderness patrols until the spring thaw. I was at home in town, sitting by the wood stove with a hot cup of coffee, when the emergency dispatch pager on my belt began to vibrate. It wasn't a standard missing person call from the sheriff. It was an automated satellite distress beacon, a personal locator signal pinging from the deepest, most inaccessible sector of the Sawtooth Wilderness. The dispatch alert came through at 11:45 at night. According to the satellite relay station in Texas, a high-frequency emergency signal had been activated near the northern terminus of Deadwood Ridge. Deadwood Ridge is an 8-mile knife-edge spine of loose scree and crumbling granite that separates the main river valley from the untamed wilderness area to the east. It is a treacherous, wind-scoured place where no trails exist, closed to all recreational foot traffic after the first snowfall. The registration data for the beacon belonged to a man named David Miller, a 42-year-old high school earth science teacher from Boise. He was an experienced solo hiker who had registered a 4-day itinerary to photograph late-season larch trees. He was 2 days overdue. "Marcus, we have a solid lock on the beacon coordinates," the dispatcher told me over the landline phone. "It's sitting squarely in the upper floor of the Deadwood Cirque, right at 6,800 feet. The signal is strong, but it's stationary. No motion detected for 3 hours. What's the weather doing on the peak?" I asked, looking out my window at the swaying pine tops in my front yard. Temperature at the base is 28 degrees and dropping. High-altitude winds are gusting at 30 knots. The local air rescue unit checked the weather and grounded their helicopter. "You're going in on foot." I assembled a 3-man quick response team. I called Wayne, a soft-spoken veteran climber who had spent 20 years working mountain rescue, and Samuel, a young former military paramedic who had joined our unit 2 years prior. By 1 o'clock in the morning, our 4-wheel drive emergency response vehicle was rattling up the abandoned Forest Service road that wound toward the base of Deadwood Ridge. The air inside the truck was tense and quiet, filled with the smell of wet canvas, heavy rubber boots, and gun oil. We checked our headlamps, verified our radio frequencies, and calibrated our GPS units. The temperature outside dropped by 2 degrees for every 500 feet of elevation we gained. By the time I pulled the truck into the snowed-in turnaround at the trailhead, the dashboard thermometer read 21 degrees. The wind was howling through the upper canopy of Douglas firs, making the towering trees groan and creak like the hull of a wooden ship. The air was bone dry and bit sharply into our exposed faces as soon as we stepped out of the heated cab. We strapped on our heavy internal frame packs, hoisted the collapsible steel stretcher between us, and clicked on our headlamps. 3 thick beams of white, lead light sliced through the swirling mountain mist, illuminating the dark, snow-dusted trail that wound upward into the shadow of the peaks. "Keep your radio volume high, and your eyes on the snow line," I told Wayne and Samuel as we adjusted our trekking poles. "If the wind picks up anymore, visibility is going to drop to 0. We stay within arm's reach at all times." We began the steep climb up the south face of the ridge. The trail faded within the first mile, swallowed by fresh snowdrifts and fallen timber. We navigated purely by compass bearing and GPS, stepping over slippery, moss-covered boulders and climbing through dense thickets of scrub oak dot. The silence between our heavy footsteps was immense. Out here, miles away from any road or town, the night felt thick and heavy, pressing against our chests with an almost physical weight. But as we crossed the 3-mile mark and entered the lower mouth of the Deadwood Cirque, the natural sounds of the night began to vanish. The wind, which had been whipping the upper tree limbs into a frenzy just 10 minutes prior, suddenly died down to a complete, unnatural standstill. The trees stood totally motionless in the freezing air, their ice-covered needles glistening like needles in our headlamp beams. There were no nocturnal bird calls, no scuttling of small rodents in the underbrush, no sound of trickling water from the frozen creek beds. It was a heavy, suffocating silence, the kind of quiet that makes the blood pounding in your own ears sound like heavy machinery. We reached the floor of the Deadwood Cirque at 3:15 in the morning. Cut. A cirque is a massive, amphitheater-like valley carved into the side of a mountain by ancient glaciers. The walls of the cirque rose over 1,200 feet straight up on three sides, sheer vertical cliffs of dark, fractured granite that blocked out the sky, leaving only a narrow strip of starless black above us. The floor of the bowl was a chaotic maze of massive talus boulders, snow-covered ice patches, and scattered stands of stunted, weather-beaten pine trees. GPS says we're within 50 yards of the distress beacon, Samuel said, pulling his glove off with his teeth to manipulate the touchscreen of his handheld receiver. The signal is coming from right inside that rock chute at the base of the north wall. I unclipped the thermal imaging camera from my chest harness and powered it on. The small digital screen glowed to life, showing a cold blue and black heat map of the granite boulder field ahead. I swept the lens slowly across the landscape, searching for any pocket of orange or yellow heat that would indicate a living human body wrapped in an emergency blanket or sleeping bag. Our sleeping bag. The screen showed nothing. The entire cirque was a uniform, bone-chilling shade of deep blue. The ambient air temperature had dropped to 14 degrees. "Let's move up in a wedge formation," I instructed, pulling my heavy radio up to my collar. "Headlamps on high power. Keep your footing solid on this ice." We picked our way across the slippery talus field, our micro spikes crunching loudly against the frozen rock. As we closed the distance to the base of the cliff wall, my nostrils flared at an unexpected scent drifting on the dead air. It was not the smell of exhaust, wood smoke, or rotting vegetation. It was a sharp, metallic tang, like fresh copper wire, mixed with the sweet, heavy smell of raw ozone. The exact odor that lingers in the air after a lightning bolt strikes a power transformer. "You guys smell that?" Wayne asked, pausing in his tracks and sweeping his headlamp across the base of the cliff. "Smells like battery acid," Samuel muttered, stepping up beside him. "Or copper." We reached the mouth of the rock chute. It was a narrow, vertical slot canyon no more than 10 feet wide, carving a dark fissure 60 yards deep into the sheer granite wall. The floor of the slot canyon was covered in a fresh, undisturbed blanket of wind-blown snow 3 inches deep. And there, sitting directly in the center of the slot canyon on top of the snow, was the emergency beacon. It was a bright orange plastic box, no larger than a deck of playing cards, its tiny red LED indicator light flashing rhythmically once every 2 seconds. Blink, blank, blink, blink, bite. I stepped into the slot canyon, my headlamp fixed on the device. I crouched down and picked it up. The plastic casing was completely dry and warm to the touch, as if it had been sitting inside a heated pocket moments before. But there was no sign of David Miller. No backpack, no tent, no discarded trash, and no blood. "Marcus, look at the snow," Wayne whispered, his voice tight. I aimed my flashlight down at the ground surrounding the spot where the beacon had been sitting. Stretched across the fresh, undisturbed snow were footprints. But they were not the tread marks of heavy mountain hiking boots. They were the prints of bare human feet. The footprints started abruptly 5 feet inside the slot canyon, as if someone had dropped straight down out of the sky onto the snow. They were long, narrow, and deeply indented into the frozen powder. But the spacing between the prints was completely wrong. The distance from the right heel to the left toe was over 8 feet apart. A stride length that would require a human being to be over 10 feet tall, or leaping through the air with impossible power. Even worse, the prints led deeper into the dead-end slot canyon, heading straight toward the solid vertical granite wall at the back of the fissure. I followed the track with my spotlight, tracing the deep, bare footprints through the snow. They marched 60 yards down the center of the narrow canyon, right up to the base of the sheer cliff wall. And then they simply stopped. There were no returning footprints. There were no signs of a struggle or a fall. The final pair of bare footprints ended cleanly, 3 inches away from the solid granite face, pointing directly into the rock wall. Where the hell did he go? Samuel asked, his voice echoing loudly off the narrow granite walls of the slot canyon. There's no ledge up there. That's a 300-foot vertical face. I stepped up to the end of the footprints, raised my headlamp, and aimed the beam straight up the cliff face. The rock wall was smooth, wet with black ice and completely vertical. Not even an experienced rock climber with technical gear could have scaled that face without leaving pitons or rope marks in the soft granite fractures. I pulled out the thermal imager again and aimed the lens straight up into the darkness above us. The digital screen flickered with static, lines of green and white noise scrolling across the monitor. I slapped the side of the housing with my gloved palm, resetting the sensor. The screen cleared, showing the black silhouette of the rock wall against the cold night sky. Then, 50 feet straight up the vertical cliff face, the screen picked up a heat signature. It wasn't a broad, diffuse heat bloom like a human body wrapped in winter clothing. It was a long, thin, vertical streak of intense, brilliant red. A hot thermal outline clinging flush against the ice-covered rock wall, completely suspended in midair. Wayne, aim your spotlight up at 50 feet, I commanded softly, my hand going instinctively to the heavy hunting knife strapped to my chest harness, right above the end of the tracks. Wayne raised his heavy 1,000-lumen spotlight and clicked the trigger. A beam of blinding white light illuminated the granite wall. The rock face was empty. There was nothing there. No climber, no ledge, no ice overhang. Just smooth, frozen granite, glistening with moisture. Yet on my thermal camera screen, the bright red heat signature was moving. It was sliding downward along the vertical rock face, coming toward us at a slow, deliberate speed, moving effortlessly down the sheer granite like a water droplet sliding down a window pane. Suddenly, the handheld radios on all 3 of our tactical vests burst into violent, static-drenched noise. It wasn't the clean, high-frequency squelch of our county channel. It was a chaotic mix of overlapping frequencies, squealing feedback, and rhythmic clicking sounds that rattled the small speakers inside our coats. Click, click, lick. Then, through the static, a voice came through. It was sharp, frantic, and filled with blind animal terror. It was a man's voice screaming into a microphone over the sound of rushing wind. Help me. Oh God, it's above the trees. It's got the line. Help. The transmission cut out abruptly with a loud, sickening pop, replaced by the flat hum of dead static. Samuel grabbed his shoulder mic, his knuckles white. Dispatch, this is Search Team 1. We have an unauthorized transmission on our operational channel. Who is speaking? Over. Static. Then, the voice came back. But it wasn't coming from the radio speaker on our vests. It came from the dark, narrow opening of the slot canyon behind us, from the empty air 15 feet above the snow. Help me. Oh God, it's above the trees. Help. The voice was an exact, pitch-perfect copy of the radio transmission we had just heard 3 seconds ago. But the cadence was completely shattered. The words were strung together without pauses, delivered in a flat, mechanical monotone that sounded like a metallic recording played through a broken horn speaker. Who's there? Wayne shouted, spinning around and leveling his spotlight toward the mouth of the canyon. "Identify yourself. We are County Mountain Rescue." The light hit nothing but falling snowflakes and empty air. Then the smell returned, 10 times stronger than before. The sharp scent of copper was so thick in the narrow granite chute that I could taste it on the back of my tongue. A bitter, metallic flavor that made my stomach turn over. The air temperature inside the slot canyon dropped so fast that fine ice crystals began forming instantly on the plastic lenses of our headlamps, dimming our vision into a murky yellow haze. Above us, high up on the sheer granite walls of the cirque, something began to move. It wasn't the sound of heavy boots or falling rocks. It was a fast, skittering sound, a soft, dry clicking noise, like thousands of wooden beads being dragged rapidly across rough sandpaper. It moved along the sheer cliff faces on both sides of the slot canyon simultaneously, circling above our heads in the pitch-black darkness. "We need to fall back now," I ordered, grabbing Samuel by the shoulder strap of his harness and shoving him toward the canyon exit. "Move! Keep your heads down and get out of the chute." We backed out of the slot canyon in a tight formation, our spotlights sweeping wildly across the dark rock faces above us. Every time the beams hit the granite, the skittering sound would freeze instantly, only to resume the moment the light moved away. As we broke out into the open floor of the cirque, something heavy detached itself from the cliff face 40 feet above us and dropped into the deep snow with a dull, sickening thud. We spun around, our heavy spotlights converging on the spot where the object had landed in the snowdrifts 30 feet away. It was not a creature. It was a backpack. It was an old, faded red external frame hiking pack, caked in yellow mud and covered in thick, dark mildew. The canvas straps were dry-rotted, fraying into long threads, and the metal zippers were completely rusted shut. I recognized the manufacturer tag on the top flap immediately. It was a brand that had gone out of business in the late 1990s. That's not David Miller's gear," Samuel breathed, his flashlight beam shaking so violently the light bounced crazily across the snow. Miller was carrying a modern black ripstop pack. I stepped forward slowly, keeping my eyes locked on the dark tree line behind the boulder, and kicked the side of the faded red pack with the toe of my boot. The rotten canvas tore open easily under the impact, spilling its frozen contents across the white snow. Out tumbled an old aluminum canteen covered in green corrosion, a pair of leather hiking boots with shattered soles, a rusted pocket knife, and a laminated Idaho driver's license. I crouched down, keeping my spotlight raised with my left hand, and picked up the frozen plastic card. The photo showed a young man with a thick beard and a wide smile. The name printed across the top read, Gregory Thomas. The expiration date on the card was October 1994. Gregory Thomas was a legendary cold case in our county. He was a 22-year-old forestry intern who had vanished into the Sawtooth Wilderness 34 years ago. His body had never been found, despite a 2-week search involving 50 ground volunteers and state police dogs. And here was his pack, dropped out of the sky onto fresh snow, 3 minutes after an emergency beacon registered to a man who had vanished 48 hours ago was activated in a dead-end granite chute. Suddenly, a loud, wet, tearing sound echoed through the cirque from the dark stand of dwarf pines to our right. It sounded like a heavy wooden log being snapped in half by hydraulic pressure, followed by the soft, wet, sliding noise of something massive dragging itself across the frozen scree. "Team leader, we have movement at 2 o'clock," Wayne shouted, drawing his sidearm from his chest holster. "In the trees, 30 yards. I raised my light toward the clump of pine trees. The branches were thrashing wildly back and forth, but there was no wind. The snow falling from the needles was being blown sideways by a localized draft of freezing air that smelled heavily of copper and decay. Through the thick needles, I caught a glimpse of something. It was not a bear. It was a tall, impossibly thin shape. A towering, segmented silhouette that stood at least 11 feet off the ground. It was wrapped in dark, wet layers of what looked like shredded tarp, rotten leather straps, and dry pine bark. It had no visible arms or legs, moving through the thick forest brush with a smooth, silent gliding motion, like a snake moving through high grass. Where its upper torso met the cold air, a pale bone-colored shape protruded from the rotten wrappings. It was smooth, devoid of eyes, nose, or mouth, reflecting our lead-light beams like polished ivory. And then, from the top of that pale, featureless shape, a sound emitted. It didn't use a throat or a mouth. The sound vibrated straight out of the air surrounding the creature, radiating through the freezing night in a loud, perfectly clear broadcast. It was my own voice. It was an exact, pitch-perfect reproduction of the command I had given to my team 10 minutes ago at the base of the trail. Keep your radio volume high and your eyes on the snow line. If the wind picks up any more, visibility is going to drop to 0. We stay within arm's reach at all times. The words were spoken with my precise vocal inflection, my precise regional accent, but they were delivered at double speed, overlapping each other in a terrifying, chaotic round that sounded like 10 copies of myself talking over one another in a small room. Fall back to the tree line, I screamed, turning away from the pine thicket. Retreat down the trail, now. We didn't walk. We ran. We abandoned the heavy steel stretcher frame in the snow, sprinted across the slippery talus field, and threw ourselves down the steep, overgrown trail that led out of the cirque. We didn't check our footing, we didn't check our compasses, and we didn't stop to look behind us. All the way down the mountain, for 3 straight miles through the pitch-black timber, the skittering sound followed us high up in the tree canopy overhead. It moved from branch to branch with terrifying speed, dropping pine cones, ice chunks, and small dry twigs onto our heads as we ran. And through the dark trees, echoing through the howling wind, our own voices kept calling back to us from the darkness, repeating our names, our radio commands, and our panicked screams in an endless, flat loop until the first light of dawn, finally, broke over the eastern peaks. We reached the emergency vehicle at 6:30 in the morning, just as the sun began to paint the high granite peaks of the Sawtooths in a dull, cold shade of rose gold. We threw ourselves into the cab, locked the doors, and slammed the truck into gear. I tore down that icy Forest Service road like a madman, fishtailing around the narrow switchbacks and smashing through snowdrifts until we hit the asphalt of the main county highway 10 miles below. We drove straight to the sheriff's office in town. The official response was swift, bureaucratic, and entirely predictable. By noon, a specialized team of state police investigators and federal park rangers had arrived at the station. They took our statements separately in windowless interrogation rooms. They took my GPS unit, Wayne's thermal camera, Samuel's radio log, and the laminated driver's license of Gregory Thomas that I had jammed into my pocket. 2 days later, the county officially closed the investigation into the disappearance of David Miller. The final report listed his cause of death as accidental exposure following a high-altitude fall. The sudden activation of his emergency locator beacon was attributed to an electrical short caused by sub-zero temperatures and battery degradation. The 34-year-old backpack belonging to Gregory Thomas was categorized as an unrelated wilderness artifact recovered from a melting ice pack. As for the bare footprints in the Slot Canyon, the thermal heat signatures on the sheer cliff face, and the voice recordings played back through the empty air, none of it made it into the official record. The state psychologist assigned to our post-mission debriefing gently suggested that our team had experienced a rare form of collective high-altitude hysteria, brought on by extreme cold physical fatigue and carbon monoxide buildup from our vehicle's exhaust system during the long drive up the trail. Wayne resigned from the search and rescue unit 3 weeks later. He packed his belongings, sold his home in Idaho, and moved to the flat, treeless plains of eastern Colorado. He never spoke to me about that night again. Samuel stayed on the team for another year, but he was never the same. He refused to take night operational shifts, and whenever a mission required entering the high cirques of the Sawtooths, he would find an excuse to stay behind at the base camp radio console. I retired from search and rescue the following spring. It has been 8 years since we ran down the trail from Deadwood Cirque. I live in a quiet town far away from the mountains now. I work as an inspector for a commercial plumbing supply company, spending my days in brightly lit concrete warehouses surrounded by steel pipes, cardboard boxes, and the comforting, predictable noise of city traffic. I sold all my winter gear. I don't own a headlamp. I don't own a GPS transceiver, and I haven't put on a pair of hiking boots since the day I handed in my county badge. Most days, I can manage to live a normal life. I can sit on my front porch, watch the sunset, and convince myself that what we saw in that slot canyon was just a trick of the mind, a nightmare born of cold wind, dark shadows, and exhaustion. But every year, when late October arrives and the first cold mountain wind blows down from the north, carrying that dry, freezing air into the valley, the fear returns. I keep every light in my house turned on until dawn. I lock my windows, draw my heavy curtains, and keep a small battery-powered radio playing white noise on my nightstand to drown out the quiet. Because sometimes, right around 3 o'clock in the morning, when the winter wind hits the side of my house and the temperature outside drops into the teens, the radio static flickers. And through the hum of the white noise, I hear a soft, metallic voice coming through the speaker. It uses my voice, the exact tone, cadence, and pitch I used when I led my team up Deadwood Ridge 8 years ago. Team leader, we have movement at 2 o'clock. In the trees. Keep your eyes on the snow line. Stay inside, Marcus. Stay inside. I never turn off the radio. I never look out the window. I just pull the blanket over my shoulders, close my eyes, and pray for the morning sun to come. If you ever find yourself hiking through the high backcountry late in the season, and the wind suddenly dies down to an absolute unnatural standstill, if the birds stop singing and the air begins to smell like fresh copper wire, do not call out to sea. Who is there? Do not check the tree line. Just turn around, keep your head down, and run as fast as you can. Because out there in the deep wilderness, some echoes are not caused by the mountains. When you spend 22 years behind the wheel of an 18-wheeler, you get to know the highway like the palm of your hand. You learn the exact location of every blind curve on Interstate 70, every cracked stretch of concrete on Route 66, and every steep grade where the mountain air cooks your drum brakes until the cab fills with the bitter stench of burning friction lining. My name is Roy Mitchell. I drove long-haul freight for over 2 decades, hauling 18-ton refrigerated loads across the vast, empty expanses of the American West. I drove a dark, green 1998 Kenworth Y100, a long-nosed sleeper, rig powered by a Caterpillar engine with an 18-speed Eaton Fuller transmission. That truck was my second home. It had 200,000 miles on the rebuilt block, twin chrome exhaust stacks that roared like thunder when I kicked the Jake brake, and a sleeper berth lined with button-tucked vinyl that smelled of old diesel fuel, dark coffee, and leather. To most folks sitting in their suburban living rooms, the high desert plateau of northern Nevada looks like nothing more than endless miles of dirt, salt brush, and sage. They see a flat line on a road map, a dry expanse to be crossed as quickly as possible during daylight hours on the way to Salt Lake City or Reno. But those of us who drive the graveyard shift know the truth. The high desert is not empty. When the sun drops behind the jagged sawtooth ridges of the Great Basin, the desert changes. The heat radiating off the cracked asphalt dies within minutes, replaced by a bitter freezing chill that sweeps down from the granite peaks. The horizon shrinks to the narrow cone of your halogen headlights, and the vast open sky turns into a pitch-black vault where the stars look cold, bright, and impossibly far away. Out there, on two-lane state roads like us, 93, you can drive for 80 miles without passing a single oncoming car, a single lighted gas station, or a single mile marker. Your cell phone turns into a useless piece of plastic. The only connection you have to the outside world is the crackling speaker of your CB radio and the low, rhythmic hum of your 18 tires rolling over the cold asphalt. In my early years on the road, I enjoyed the solitude. I liked the quiet rhythm of night driving, the glow of the amber dash lights, the steady purr of the diesel engine, and the simple satisfaction of delivering 40,000 pounds of freight on schedule. I didn't listen to the tall tales traded by older drivers at the truck stops, stories about phantom hitchhikers, glowing lights hovering over the salt flats, or strange, upright shapes that chased semi-trucks at 70 miles per hour. I believed in mechanical engineering, weight distributions, air pressure gauges, and physical stamina. I knew that if a driver saw something strange in the middle of the desert at 3 o'clock in the morning, it was almost always the result of microsleeps, highway hypnosis, or too many hours spent sitting behind the wheel on a steady diet of black, coffee and ephedrine pills. I held on to that belief until a bitter Tuesday night in late November of 2019. I was pulling a 53-foot aluminum reefer trailer loaded with frozen beef from a packing plant in southern Idaho down through the high desert corridor toward Phoenix. It was a route I had driven 100 times before. But that night, as I crossed the state line onto an isolated 60-mile stretch of Route 93, known locally as the Dead Stretch, I learned that some things in the wilderness do not belong to nature, and they do not care how fast your truck can run. I pulled into an abandoned turnout 20 miles south of the border at 11 o'clock at night to conduct my mandatory mid-trip equipment check. The air outside the cab was 18 degrees, bone-dry and cutting. The high desert wind was whistling through the telephone wires that paralleled the highway, making a low, mournful sound like a pipe organ playing in an empty church. I pulled my heavy leather work gloves on, grabbed my steel tire thumper club, and stepped out onto the gravel shoulder. My boots crunched loudly in the frozen dirt. I walked slowly around the entire perimeter of the rig, tapping each of the 18 heavy radial tires with the wooden club. Thump. Thump-a-dee. Thump-a-die. The rubber rang out high and tight, proper air pressure all around. I checked the heavy steel locking jaws on the fifth wheel coupling, verified that the rubber air brake lines were securely hooked up, and glanced at the digital temperature display on the nose of the refrigerated trailer. 32 degrees, internal temp. Perfect. Everything on my rig was operating within exact operating specs. But as I stood near the rear tandem axles, holding my flashlight beam against the shiny aluminum bumper, the silence of the desert hit me. Normally, even on the quietest desert stretches, you hear background sounds. You hear the wind whipping through the dry sagebrush, the distant yip of coyotes hunting across the salt flats, or the creak of old wooden fence posts settling in the frost. Here, there was nothing. The wind had suddenly dropped to an absolute dead standstill. The desert floor lay totally motionless, locked beneath a heavy, suffocating quiet. I clicked my flashlight off for a second to let my eyes adjust to the darkness. The stars above were razor sharp, but the surrounding desert landscape was pitch black, swallowed by a thick, heavy shadow that seemed to soak up the moonlight. Then, from out of the pitch-black sagebrush 30 yards off the right shoulder of the highway, I heard a sound. It was a slow, wet, scraping noise, like a heavy wooden beam being dragged slowly across dry gravel. I whipped my flashlight back on, sweeping the bright halogen beam across the high sagebrush. "Whoever's out there, step into the light," I called out, my voice sounding thin and flat in the vast open air. "This is private freight. State police patrol this route. The light hit nothing but gray sagebrush and twisted Joshua trees. The sound stopped instantly the moment the beam crossed the dirt. I didn't linger. I climbed back up into the high cab of the Kenworth, slammed the heavy door, threw the iron deadbolt into place, and adjusted my seatbelt. I popped the parking brake valves with a loud, sharp hiss of released air, slotted the Eaton Fuller transmission into third gear, and pulled back onto the empty two-lane asphalt of Route 93. I accelerated steadily, running up through the gears until the speed needle sat comfortably on 65 miles per hour. The big Caterpillar engine hummed smoothly beneath the long hood, and the twin exhaust stacks threw a dark cloud of diesel smoke into the cold night air behind me. I reached up and unclipped the microphone of my Cobra CB radio, flipping the dial to channel 19, the universal highway frequency. Brake 19 for any southbound power on Route 93, I said into the mic, my thumb resting on the push-to-talk button. This is Night Hauler sitting at mile marker 42. Anybody else out here on the quiet ribbon tonight? Over. Static answered. A harsh, constant white noise that hissed through the small overhead speaker. Kirsch. I reached over and adjusted the squelch knob, trying to clear the signal. The static smoothed out, but no driver answered. I was the only rig on an 80-mile stretch of blacktop. The 10 minutes passed. The highway stretched ahead in an unbroken straight line through the high desert basin, bisecting the dark horizon like a black ribbon. Then, the CB speaker popped loudly. The static cleared for a fraction of a second, and a voice came through the speaker. It was faint, distorted by high electrical interference, but the words were clear. Brake 19. Night Hauler. Sitting at mile marker 42. Anybody else out here on the quiet ribbon tonight? Over. My heart did a quick, violent thud against my ribs. It was my own voice. It was an exact pitch-perfect playback of the call I had made into the microphone 10 minutes ago. But the transmission was completely unnatural. The gaps between my words had been stripped away, and the tone was completely flat, robotic, hollow, and devoid of any human breath or inflection. Very funny, I muttered into the mic, forcing a harsh laugh. Who's playing with the tape deck? State your handle. The speaker clicked instantly in response. Very funny. Who's playing? State your handle. My voice echoed back through the cab speaker. Instantly, flatly, unnaturally. I reached up with a shaking hand and clicked the power dial on the radio, shutting the unit down completely. The red digital display died, and the cab returned to the familiar, comforting roar of the Caterpillar diesel engine. I told myself it was an atmospheric echo, a high-voltage skip signal bouncing off the radio towers near the military bombing range 50 miles to the west. Drivers talked about radio skips all the time in the break rooms. It was simple physics. Nothing more. I settled back into my seat, gripped the big two-spoke steering wheel with both hands, and kept my eyes glued to the dark asphalt ahead. That was when I glanced into my driver's side mirror. The side mirror on a Kenworth Y100 is a large, rectangular piece of flat glass mounted on a chrome bracket right outside the cab window. It gives you a crystal-clear view along the 53-foot aluminum flank of your trailer down to the rear tandem tires. I looked into the mirror, expecting to see the steady red glow of my trailer running lights, reflecting off the white lane markers. Instead, I saw a shape running alongside my rear tires. It was not behind the trailer. It was running parallel to the rear axle, right on the white fog line on the edge of the asphalt, keeping pace with the truck at 65 miles per hour. My first thought was that a wild horse or a massive stray cow had bolted out of the desert scrub and was running along the shoulder. But no animal in North America can run at 65 miles per hour for more than a few seconds, let alone maintain a steady, effortless distance alongside an 18-wheeler. I adjusted the electric mirror toggle, angling the glass downward to get a better look. The shape was tall and impossibly thin. It moved on 4 long, segmented limbs that looked like a grotesque fusion of human arms and animal bone. Its stride length was massive, covering 15 feet with every fluid, sickening leap. It didn't bounce or jostle as it ran. It seemed to glide across the rough gravel shoulder, its body remaining on a perfectly horizontal plane parallel to the road. Worse yet, it had no headlights behind it, no reflection in its path, and its body appeared to be wrapped in dark, wet strips of dry hide and matted fur that fluttered wildly in the 80-mile-an-hour wind draft created by the trailer. I stared into the mirror, my brain refusing to process what my eyes were seeing. "No," I whispered out loud, my knuckles turning bone white against the leather steering wheel cover. "No, that's a shadow. That's a trick of the reflection." I pressed my right foot down hard on the accelerator pedal. The Caterpillar engine let out a deep, guttural roar as the turbocharger spooled up, shoving 30 pounds of boost into the cylinders. The speed needle climbed past 65, creeping up to 70, 75, 80 miles per hour. The heavy steel frame of the truck began to vibrate as the wheels pounded over the rough desert asphalt. In the mirror, the shape didn't drop back an inch. It matched my speed instantly, moving with effortless, terrifying ease. It began to close the distance between the rear axles and the cab, sliding forward along the smooth aluminum side wall of the trailer. Then came the sound. It started as a low, rhythmic tapping against the exterior metal panels of the sleeper, berthed directly behind my driver's seat. Tap, dud, tap, dud em all. Tap, dud. It was a sharp, hard impact, like someone taking a heavy wooden mallet and striking the aluminum skin of the trailer at regular 2-second intervals. The sound moved forward. Tap, dud. Tap, dud. Tap. Dow. It moved past the trailer doors, past the reefer unit, right up to the side of the sleeper cab. The force of the impacts was so strong that I felt the vibrations traveling through the steel frame of my seat, up through my boots and into my jawline. "Get away from the rig!" I screamed, slamming my right hand down onto the air horn lanyard. The heavy air horns mounted on the cab roof let out a deafening 2-tone blast that shattered the silence of the night. The sound echoed across the empty salt flats for miles. The tapping stopped instantly. For 3 long, agonizing miles, there was only the roar of my engine and the screaming wind outside the cab windows. I kept my eyes fixed on the road ahead, refusing to look back into the side mirrors, my heart pounding so hard in my chest I felt sick. Then, the passenger side cab window cracked. It didn't shatter. The heavy safety glass groaned under a sudden, concentrated pressure from the outside, a fine web of hairline fractures spreading outward across the pane like a frozen spider web. I gasped, flinching away from the passenger door, my hands jerking the steering wheel slightly. The 53-foot trailer swayed violently behind me before I managed to correct the line, keeping the big rig inside the narrow asphalt lane. I slowly turned my head to look across the wide cab toward the passenger window. Outside the shattered glass, hovering 6 feet off the ground right beside the passenger door at 80 miles per hour, was a head. It had no face. It was a long, narrow, bone-colored mass, wrapped tightly in dried, grayish-yellow hide that looked like ancient parchment stretched over a human skull. Where its eyes should have been, there were 2 deep, hollow sockets filled with pitch-black shadow. But deep inside those sockets, 2 tiny points of pale amber light reflected the green glow of my dashboard instruments. It held itself perfectly level with my cab, unaffected by the freezing 80-mile-an-hour wind screaming past the truck frame. Then, The creature opened its mouth. It did not have lips or teeth. The lower jaw simply unhinged, dropping 6 inches straight down to reveal a dark, hollow cavity lined with pale, calcified ridges. And from that open cavity, a sound burst into the sealed cab of my truck. It was not a roar or a scream. It was my CB radio speaker voice again, but this time, it wasn't playing through the radio. It was vibrating directly through the safety glass, radiating into the metal air ducts and steering column. It was playing back every conversation I had ever held over the radio waves for the last 20 years. Fragments of truck stop chatter, weather updates, calls home to my wife, gear checks, and long-forgotten highway jokes, all smashed together into a chaotic, terrifying wall of sound. Snowing on the pass. Hey Roy, pick up some coffee. Fuel pressure dropping. Night hauler coming through. I'm tired, honey. So tired. Brake 19. Brake 19. Stop the truck. Roy, stop the truck. The voices overlapped, speeded up, and slowed down, shifting pitch from a deep, rumbling growl to a high-pitched metallic screech that made my ears bleed. Along with the sound came the smell. It poured through the cab's fresh air vents, a thick, suffocating stench of fresh copper, wet fur, and rotting meat. So intense it burned the back of my throat and made my eyes water profusely. No, I yelled, reaching out and flipping the air recirculation switch to shut the outside vents. Get off my truck! I reached down with my right hand, grabbed a heavy steel tire thumper club from the floorboards beside my seat, and held it tight in my fist. I couldn't shoot a gun while steering an 80,000-pound rig at 80 miles per hour down a dark 2-lane highway, but I was not going to let that thing break through the glass without a fight. The creature raised a long 3-jointed limb, a limb wrapped in dark, matted hair and tipped with long, bone-white talons, and pressed it flat against the cracked passenger window glass. The heavy safety glass groaned again, bowing inward under immense, impossible force. I knew that if that glass failed, if that freezing air and that copper-smelling monstrosity got inside the cab, I would never reach the state line. I would become another abandoned rig parked on the shoulder of Route 93. Another cold case file sitting in a county sheriff's drawer in Ely. Ahead on the horizon, 2 miles through the dark windshield, I saw a light. It was not a car headlight. It was the bright, harsh sodium glow of a state highway port of entry inspection station sitting right at the junction of Highway 93 and Interstate 15 CI. The station was lit up like a football stadium, flooded with thousands of watts of brilliant white light, surrounded by steel weigh scales, security cameras, and state police patrol cruisers. I held my foot flat to the floorboards, letting the Caterpillar engine scream at maximum engine RPMs, heading straight for those sodium lights like a dying man reaching for water. The moment the nose of my Kenworth crossed the outer perimeter of the inspection station's sodium floodlights, the pressure on the passenger window vanished. There was no sound of a body dropping to the road, no screech of claws sliding off the aluminum bodywork, no final roar of frustration. 1 second the pale, bark-wrapped head was pressing against my glass. The next second the air outside the cab was empty. I slammed my feet down on both the service brakes and the engine retarder simultaneously. The heavy truck bucked violently, the air brake screaming in a long, high-pitched screech of protest as the 18 tires locked up, burning rubber across the concrete scale lanes. The trailer jackknifed slightly to the left before settling straight, bringing the massive green rig to a shuddering halt 3 feet away from the state trooper's glass inspection booth. I sat in the air ride seat for several seconds, my hands locked so tightly around the leather steering wheel cover that my fingers had gone completely numb. My chest was heaving, my shirt soaked through with cold sweat, and the bitter taste of copper was still burning the back of my tongue. A senior state trooper stepped out of the lit booth, holding a heavy Maglite flashlight, an annoyed expression on his face. He walked up to my driver's side window and motioned for me to roll it down. I pressed the electric window button. The glass slid down 6 inches, letting in the clean, freezing night air. "What in the hell do you think you're doing, driver?" the trooper demanded, shining his heavy light beam right into my face. "You came into a port of entry at 60 miles per hour. You nearly took out the weigh-scale arm." I couldn't speak. My jaw was trembling so violently I couldn't form words. I just pointed a shaking finger toward the passenger side of the cab. The trooper lowered his light and walked around the front bumper of the Kenworth to the passenger side. He stood there for a long moment, sweeping his flashlight beam across the door, the sleeper berth, and the front corner of the aluminum trailer. When he walked back to my driver's side window, his annoyed expression was gone. His face had turned a pale, chalky shade of gray, and his hand was resting firmly on the leather retention strap of his sidearm holster. "Driver," he said, his voice low and tight, "turn off your engine and step out of the cab." Slowly. I shut off the ignition key. The Caterpillar engine died with a heavy shudder, and the cab went completely quiet. I opened the door, stepped down off the chrome fuel tank steps, and leaned against the cold aluminum door panel to keep my legs from collapsing under me. The trooper didn't ask me for my logbook. He didn't ask me for my driver's license. He didn't ask me why I was speeding. He just stood there, shining his flashlight along the passenger side of my rig. The entire passenger door panel was crushed inward, as if a hydraulic clamp had squeezed the heavy steel shell. Deep, jagged gouges, 4 inches deep and 3 feet long, were carved straight through the heavy aluminum skin of the trailer, slicing through the metal like wet cardboard. And sticking to the shattered glass of the passenger window was a thick, dark liquid that had frozen solid in the freezing air. A black, oily substance that smelled intensely of copper and ozone. An old gray-haired weigh station operator stepped out of the office building, holding a cup of coffee. He walked over, glanced at the deep gouges carved into the side of my aluminum trailer, and then looked out into the pitch-black desert night beyond the perimeter lights. The old man didn't look surprised. He took a slow sip of his coffee, looked me dead in the eye, and spoke in a quiet, tired voice that I will never forget. "You didn't stop on the dead stretch, did you, son?" he asked softly. "No," I managed to choke out, my voice cracking. I kept driving." The old man nodded slowly, turning back toward his heated office. "Good," he said quietly. "If you had stopped, we'd just be looking for an empty truck on the shoulder tomorrow morning." I never drove Route 93 again. In fact, I quit long-haul cross-country driving altogether less than 2 months after that night. I sold my green Kenworth Y100 to a regional fleet company in Utah, taking a massive financial loss just to get that vehicle out of my sight. I couldn't look at the passenger door, I couldn't look at the CB radio, and I couldn't sit in that sleeper berth without feeling a cold wave of suffocating terror wash over me. I moved back to my hometown in eastern Kansas, taking a local job driving a day cab dump truck for a rock quarry. I work 8-hour shifts during daylight hours, hauling gravel between crushed stone yards and highway construction sites. I drive a plain, white truck with no sleeper berth, no CB radio, and no long-distance routes. I am home every afternoon by 4 o'clock. I live in a brightly lit house in a quiet suburban neighborhood surrounded by streetlights, chain-link fences, and neighbors who mow their lawns on Saturday mornings. It has been 7 years since that night on the dead stretch. My wife thinks I retired from long-haul driving because of my back. She thinks 20 years of sitting in an air ride seat caught up with me, and I wanted a quieter life closer to home. I never told her about the cracked passenger window, the metallic smell of copper, or the voice that came through the glass at 80 miles per hour. Some things are too heavy to share with the people you love. Most days, I can manage to live a normal, quiet life. I can drive my pickup truck to the grocery store, watch the high school football games on Friday nights, and convince myself that what I saw in that desert mirror was just a severe hallucination brought on by exhaustion, caffeine pills, and highway hypnosis. But the night does not let you forget so easily. Every year, when late autumn arrives and the temperature drops into the teens, bringing that dry, freezing wind across the plains, my old habits return. My old habits return. I check the double deadbolts on my front door 3 times before going to bed. I pull down the heavy insulated blinds in my bedroom, making sure not a single inch of dark glass is exposed to the backyard outside. And I never, under any circumstances, keep a CB radio in my house or my personal vehicle. Yet sometimes, right around 3 o'clock in the morning, when the house is totally dark and the winter wind howls through the power lines outside my bedroom window, I wake up. I lie perfectly still in the dark, my heart hammering against my ribs, listening to the quiet house. And then, from the wooden exterior siding right behind my headboard, on the 2nd floor of my suburban house, I hear it. Tap. Dot all. Tap. Dot. Tap. Dot. 3 sharp, precise strikes against the wood, moving slowly along the outer wall toward my window. And then, floating softly through the glass from the pitch-black night outside, a voice speaks in the quiet darkness. It uses my voice, the exact tone, cadence, and pitch I used when I talked to the quarry dispatcher 3 hours ago. Dump truck 42, clear for unloading. Stay inside, Roy. Stay inside. I never go to the window. I never turn on the yard floodlights. I just press my face into the pillow, hold my wife's hand in the dark, and pray for the morning sun to come. If you ever find yourself driving those empty 2-lane desert highways late at night, and your CB radio starts playing back your own voice, if the wind suddenly dies down to a dead standstill and the air begins to smell like fresh copper wire, do not look into your side mirrors. Do not press the brake pedal. Just keep your eyes on the road ahead, hold the accelerator down, and keep driving until you see the lights of town. Because out there on the dark asphalt, some things are running right beside you, and they are not looking for a ride.